Hey there and welcome back. The day is behind you now, whatever it held, and there is nothing left to do with it but set it down and rest. So let the room go soft around you, let your shoulders drop, and let me take you somewhere far from here. Tonight, our subject is a woman who stood at one of the great turning points of the English story, the slow crossing from the medieval world into the one we would begin to call modern. She came into the world while knights still settled the fate of kingdoms on the battlefield, while the old feudal certainties still held, while England looked backward to 1,000 years of much the same, and she left it in 1492, the very year a Genoese sailor crossed an ocean and changed the shape of the known earth, with a new kind of monarchy rising at home and her own granddaughter's blood destined to sit on the throne for 100 years to come. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville. She was a country gentleman's daughter who became a queen by a marriage that scandalized a kingdom, and her long and turbulent life happened to fall exactly across the seam where one age ended and another began. That is where we are going tonight, into the life of a woman who lived on the hinge of history. Now, a small thing before the story proper begins. I am always curious about who is out there in the quiet with me, so if you would like to say where in the world you are listening from, and what the hour is where you sit, leave a word below and I will look through them later. There is something companionable in it, all these scattered rooms turned toward the same old tale at the same late hour. And if the slow unspooling of a life from long ago is the sort of thing you would like more of, you are welcome to subscribe with no urgency at all, so that the next of these evenings can find you when it comes. That is the whole of the housekeeping. The rest of the night belongs to her. Our story opens in the rolling farmland of Northamptonshire, in the middle years of the 1400s, at a manor house called Grafton. This was the heart of England, a country of hedged fields and slow rivers and market towns, and the family that held Grafton was respectable without being grand-landed gentry, comfortable, well-connected, but a long way from the front rank of the realm. Sir Richard Woodville, the master of the house, was a soldier and a courtier of real ability but modest birth. His wife, though, was another matter entirely, and it is with her that any honest account of Elizabeth must start, because the daughter inherited much from the mother. Jacquetta of Luxembourg was a genuine aristocrat of the European mould, descended from the counts of a small but ancient continental house, and she traced her bloodline, with some justice, all the way back to the Emperor Charlemagne. She had crossed the Channel as a girl to wed John, Duke of Bedford, a brother of the warrior King Henry V, and for a stretch the man who governed England's possessions in France, a match that lifted her, while it lasted, into the very top rank of women in the kingdom. And then, widowed and still young, she had done something almost unheard of for a woman of her station. She had married for love and married down, taking the handsome and untitled Richard Woodville as her second husband in defiance of every expectation. It cost them a heavy fine and a season of royal displeasure, but it also produced, around the year 1437, a first daughter, and that daughter, raised on the example of a mother who had bent the rules of rank to suit her own heart, would one day do the very same thing on an infinitely grander stage. The mother's story deserves more than a passing word, because Jacquetta of Luxembourg is one of the genuinely remarkable women of the century, and her example hovered over her daughter's whole life. She belonged to the high nobility of the continent, a family that counted emperors and crusaders among its forebears, and she had been raised to expect a brilliant marriage and got one wed as a young woman to the most powerful Englishman in France. When that husband died and left her a wealthy young widow, the sensible course was to wait for her family to arrange a second grand match. Instead, she married, quietly and for love, a handsome member of her late husband's household, a man so far beneath her in rank that the marriage was a minor scandal across 2 kingdoms. The crown fined the couple heavily for marrying without permission, but Jacquetta held her ground, kept her husband, and bore him a large brood of children, and she retained enough of her standing and her formidable presence to remain a figure of consequence at court for decades. Her eldest daughter grew up watching a woman who had defied the rules of rank for love and made it stick, and who had survived the consequences with her dignity intact. It is not hard to see, in the daughter's later willingness to marry a king against all advice, the lesson the mother had taught by example. There is a darker thread to Jacquetta's story too, one that would later be turned against her daughter, and it is worth knowing, because she came of an exotic foreign house, and carried herself with an aristocrat's confidence, and perhaps because she was simply a strong and unusual woman. Rumours of witchcraft attached themselves to Jacquetta in her later years. When Warwick wished to strike at the Woodvilles, one of the weapons he reached for was an accusation of sorcery against Elizabeth's mother, the charge that she had used dark arts to ensnare the king into the marriage with her daughter. The accusation came to nothing in the end. It was the kind of slander that powerful enemies threw at inconvenient women, and it was formally cleared. But it left a stain, and the whisper of witchcraft would cling to Elizabeth herself in later years. The suggestion that she and her mother had bewitched a king into a marriage no sane king would have made. It is a revealing slander, because it shows how the age made sense of a woman who had achieved something extraordinary, rather than credit her with intelligence or beauty or force of will. It reached for the supernatural, as though only magic could explain a low-born woman's capture of a crown. The charge of witchcraft was, in its way, a backhanded tribute to how impossible Elizabeth's rise seemed to those who watched it. The connection to Charlemagne that Jacquetta's line could claim is more than a piece of genealogical vanity, for it points to a truth about Elizabeth's mixed inheritance that helps explain her. On her father's side, she was English gentry, respectable but unremarkable, rooted in the soil of the Midland Shires. On her mother's side, she was high European aristocracy, descended from emperors, carrying in her blood the proud traditions of the continental nobility. She was, in a sense, a fusion of two worlds, the solid, modest, practical world of the English manor, and the grand, ancient, self-assured world of the European high nobility. And it is tempting to see both strands in the woman she became. The English gentry gave her the practical competence, the head for management and survival, the unglamorous resilience of people who work their own lands. The continental aristocracy gave her, perhaps, the pride and the nerve and the sense of her own worth, the refusal to accept that her birth set a ceiling on her destiny, the willingness to reach for a crown. She had her mother's example of a great lady who married for love against all advice, and her mother's blood of emperors, and her father's English steadiness, all combined in one formidable woman. It made for an unusual inheritance, and it produced an unusual daughter, one equipped by her mixed origins to do what neither pure gentry nor pure aristocracy might have dared. It is worth dwelling, too, on the famous beauty that the sources agree Elizabeth possessed, for it was no trivial matter in the shaping of her fortunes. The chroniclers, hostile and friendly alike, are united on this point. She was a strikingly beautiful woman, fair-haired and graceful, with a calm and lovely face that drew the eye and held it. In an age that set high store by such things, and in the particular drama of a king's desire, her beauty was a real force, one of the few cards a woman in her position could play, and she played it to extraordinary effect. But it would be a mistake to reduce her to her looks, as some accounts have done, painting her as merely a pretty face that happened to catch a king's eye. Beauty alone does not hold a king to marriage against all his counsel, nor steer a course through the deadly currents of a court, nor engineer a dynasty's overthrow from a sanctuary. What the beauty opened, the intelligence and the nerve had to secure, and it was the combination that made her formidable. Her loveliness drew Edward, Her wit and her self-command kept him and made her a queen. The fairness of her face has been remembered, sometimes at the expense of the sharpness of her mind, but it was the mind, in the end, that shaped her story. The beauty was the occasion of her rise. The character was its engine, and of the two, it is the character that deserves the larger place in any honest reckoning of the woman she was. Before we go further, there is something to say about the very age Elizabeth was born into, for it is one that scholars have never quite agreed how to name, and her life sits squarely on the disputed ground. There is no clean line between where the medieval world ends and the Renaissance begins, no single year on which one age stops and the next starts, and historians have argued the point for as long as there have been historians to argue it. Some look at England in the later 1400s and see the last chapter of the Middle Ages, a world still feudal in its bones, still governed by knights and barons, and the old certainties of faith and rank, medieval through and through. Others look at the same decades and see the first pale light of something new, the printing press arriving, the learning of the Italian Renaissance beginning to filter north, the centralized state stirring into life, the ships preparing to sail beyond the edges of the known map. The truth is that both are right, because an age does not change all at once but unevenly, in patches, the new growing up inside the old long before anyone notices the old has gone. Elizabeth's lifetime falls precisely across this unsettled seam, in the years the textbooks cannot tidily file under one heading or the other. And that is part of what makes her such a rewarding figure to follow, for in her single life you can watch the one world shading into the next, the medieval giving slow ground to the modern, the change passing through her as it passed through her country. She is a woman of the in-between, and the in-between is exactly where the interesting history happens. To make sense of the woman, you have to feel the texture of the England that shaped her. And it was a harder and stranger place than the green Northamptonshire fields suggest. The throne was held by Henry VI, a king cut from gentle cloth, devout, scholarly, generous, and almost entirely unfit to wield power. He suffered periods when his mind simply withdrew from the world, leaving him unable to speak or recognize those around him, and a kingdom cannot be governed by a man who cannot govern himself. Around that vacancy at the centre, the mighty magnates circled. These were men who commanded private armies in the thousands, who held whole counties in their grip, and whose loyalty to the crown lasted exactly as long as the crown served their interests. With the weak king and ambitious lords, the realm drifted toward the long civil bloodletting that later ages would name the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic quarrel between two branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, both descended from the same distant king, both convinced of their right to rule. This was the world young Elizabeth grew up watching, a beautiful, brittle, dangerous country, where fortunes could rise or be destroyed on the outcome of a single afternoon's fighting. The dynastic quarrel at the root of it all is worth setting out plainly, because its logic governed everything that happened to Elizabeth. 2 generations before her birth, an English king had been deposed and murdered by a cousin, and that act of usurpation had left a poisoned inheritance, a crown whose legitimacy could always be questioned, held by a line that others believed had no true right to it. The House of Lancaster sat on the throne. The House of York believed the throne was rightfully theirs. So long as a strong king wore the crown, the rival claim could be suppressed. But under the feeble Henry VI, the question reopened, and once it had reopened, it could not be closed except by blood. Each side could point to a plausible right. Each killing demanded a reckoning, and the great families of the land took their places behind one banner or the other and fought it out across 30 years. This was not a war of foreign invasion or popular revolt, but a family feud raised to the scale of a kingdom, a quarrel among cousins for a contested crown. And because it was a family quarrel, it was peculiarly savage, for nothing is fought more bitterly than a feud among kin, and no mercy is shown so rarely as between relatives who have learned to hate one another. What made this particular conflict so corrosive was that there was no clean answer to the question it turned on. In some civil wars, one side is plainly the rightful party, and the other plainly the rebel, and the quarrel can end when right prevails. The Wars of the Roses had no such clarity. Both houses descended from the same king. Both could muster a genuine, arguable claim. Learned men could and did line up on either side, and no court or council could settle the matter beyond dispute. When a question of such magnitude has no agreed answer, it can only be decided by force, and force decides nothing permanently, for the losing side can always argue that right was on its side, and the verdict of one battle merely temporary. So the wars dragged on, flaring and subsiding across 3 decades, because no victory could ever be final while the underlying question remained genuinely open. Each side could always tell itself that the other were the usurpers, and that God in the next battle might restore the rightful line. It was a quarrel that could not be reasoned to a close, only exhausted into one, and in the end it was exhaustion, and a marriage that joined the rival claims rather than choosing between them, that finally brought the thing to rest. Elizabeth's daughter's wedding succeeded precisely where 30 years of battles had failed, because it dissolved the question instead of trying to answer it. The human cost of all this, beneath the dynastic abstractions, is worth keeping steadily in view, because it is easy to lose the suffering in the strategy. Behind every battle in the Wars of the Roses lay the ordinary catastrophe of war, men killed, widows made, children orphaned, lands wasted, the slow grinding misery that falls on a country torn by repeated fighting. The great lords played their Game of Thrones across 3 decades, and the ordinary people of England paid for it in blood and ruin, their crops trampled, their sons conscripted, their towns sacked, their peace shattered again and again by quarrels not their own. Elizabeth's story is one of the visible ones, a queen whose sufferings the chroniclers recorded. But behind her stood countless invisible others, the unrecorded women who lost husbands and sons exactly as she did, without the consolation of a crown or a place in history. Her widowhood at St. Albans was multiplied 10,000 times across the kingdom, in cottages and manor houses whose grief no one wrote down. It is worth remembering this, lest the drama of kings and queens make us forget that the wars were, for most of those who lived through them, simply a long affliction visited on the innocent by the ambition of the great. Elizabeth suffered grievously, and her suffering stands, in a way, for all the suffering of her age that history did not trouble to record. It helps, too, to fix in the mind the broad shape of the wars, since their tangled course can otherwise blur into a confusion of battles and betrayals. The essential movement is this. For decades the rivalry between Lancaster and York simmered beneath a weak king, then broke into open fighting in the middle of the century. The Yorkists won the throne under Edward, lost it briefly when Warwick turned his coat and restored the old king, then won it back decisively when Edward returned and destroyed his enemies at Barnet and Tewkesbury. There followed a dozen years of Yorkist peace under Edward, until his sudden death opened the way for his brother Richard to seize the crown, setting aside Edward's sons. Richard's usurpation provoked the final reaction, the invasion of Henry Tudor, who killed Richard at Bosworth and founded the Tudor dynasty, marrying Edward's daughter to unite the warring claims and so bringing the wars at last to a close. That is the arc across some 30 years. Rivalry, war, Yorkist triumph, brief reversal, Yorkist restoration, usurpation, and final resolution under the Tudors. Elizabeth Woodville's life threads through the whole of it, from the early fighting that widowed her to the final marriage that crowned her daughter. She was present, in one role or another, at nearly every turn of the long story, and few people experienced its full sweep as completely as she did, carried by it from a country manor to a throne and through every height and depth between. Of her actual girlhood, the records say almost nothing, which was how the age treated nearly all its women, even those who would later loom large. No one thought a gentry daughter worth chronicling until she became remarkable, and by then her childhood was long past and unrecorded. So we are left to reconstruct it from what we know of how such girls were raised. She would have been schooled in the running of a great household, for a manor was a small economy in itself, with its stores and servants and accounts, its brewing and baking and the management of dozens of dependents. She would have learned to read, certainly, and to handle the devotions that filled a pious household's day. She would have absorbed needlework, music, the bearing and courtesy expected of a well-born young woman. And she would have learned above all the central lesson of a woman's life in that age, that her chief instrument in the world would be marriage, that her body and her bloodline were assets to be deployed, and that her advancement and her family's would rise or fall on the matches that were made for her. Elizabeth learned these lessons unusually well. The proof would come later, written across the whole astonished face of the kingdom, by the custom of the time she was married young, around the age of 15, to a neighbour of suitable rank, Sir John Grey, who stood to inherit a barony and came from a staunchly Lancastrian family in the Midland country. It was an ordinary match, the sort arranged between two respectable families to their mutual benefit, and by every sign it was a contented one. Elizabeth bore her young husband 2 sons, Thomas and Richard, and settled into the life that lay before her, the life of a baron's wife, mistress of an estate, mother of the next generation, her days given over to the unremarkable and unending work of keeping a great house and raising its children. Had the wider world stayed calm, that is the whole of the life she would have led, and her name would never have travelled beyond her own county. But the wider world did not stay calm. The slow-gathering quarrel between Lancaster and York was about to break into open war, and Sir John Grey, like every fighting man of his rank, would be called to take his side and risk his life for it. The quiet country existence Elizabeth had been raised for was about to be torn from under her. The contrast between this ordinary beginning and the extraordinary life that followed is one of the things that makes Elizabeth's story so compelling, and it is worth letting it register fully. Here was a girl whose life, as it began, was entirely unremarkable. A gentry daughter married to a gentry son, settling into the management of an estate and the bearing of children, her horizons bounded by her county and her station, her future as predictable as the seasons. Thousands of women lived exactly such lives in that age and vanished from history without a trace, their names and stories unrecorded because nothing remarkable ever happened to them. Elizabeth might have been one of them. For the first 20-odd years of her life, she was indistinguishable from them, an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. And then the wars reached into that ordinary life and shattered it, killing her husband and setting her on the road that would lead, by an improbable series of turns, to a throne. It is a reminder that extraordinary lives often begin in the most ordinary circumstances, and that the people who shape history are frequently those who began with no expectation of doing any such thing. Elizabeth was not born to greatness or raised for it. Greatness was thrust upon her, or seized by her, out of a life that had promised nothing of the kind. The country gentlewoman became a queen, not because she was destined to, but because the violence of her age tore her ordinary life apart and flung her, by chance and by her own nerve, onto an extraordinary path. There is a further point worth making about her name and the title by which she is sometimes known, for it captures something of how she has lived in the imagination. In her own first marriage she was Dame Elizabeth Grey, and after her fall, when Richard had unmade her queenship, she was reduced to that name again, the queen erased, and the knight's widow restored. Later ages, drawn to the romance and the tragedy of her story, gave her a more evocative title, remembering her as the White Queen, after the White Rose of the House of York, whose queen she became. The name has a certain poetry to it, and it has carried her story to audiences who know little else of the period, the White Queen standing as a figure of beauty and sorrow and survival amid the bloody quarrel of the roses. But there is an irony in it too, for the White Rose was the emblem of the house that her own scheming would ultimately see joined to its old enemy and absorbed into something new. The White Queen ended her life as the architect of the rose's transformation, the red and white combined into the Tudor flower in her own grandchildren. She was the last great queen of pure York and the grandmother of the dynasty that dissolved York and Lancaster alike into itself. The title remembers her as a figure of one side in the old quarrel. Her achievement was to help bring that quarrel, and the world that sustained it, to an end. Marriage at such an age to a husband chosen by others was simply the ordinary shape of a young woman's life, and we should resist reading modern feeling into it. A girl was not consulted about her marriage any more than she was consulted about her birth. The match was arranged between families for reasons of property and alliance and standing, and love, if it came afterward, as a fortunate addition rather than a precondition. By the look of it, Elizabeth's first marriage was a reasonably happy one within these terms. The Greys were a respectable family of solid rank. The match was suitable, and the union produced 2 healthy sons within a few years, which was the central purpose for which it had been made. Elizabeth settled into the role she had been bred for, the mistress of a manor and the mother of its heirs, with every expectation of living out her life along the comfortable, unremarkable lines that such a marriage laid down. There is no sign in any of this of the extraordinary destiny to come. She was in these years simply one more well-born young wife among hundreds indistinguishable from her peers, doing exactly what was expected of her. But what set her apart was not yet visible. It would take a catastrophe to bring it out. The first marriage also placed Elizabeth, by no choice of her own, on the Lancastrian side of the Great Divide, and this accident of allegiance would shape the early disasters of her life. The Greys were a Lancastrian family. In marrying into them, Elizabeth became, for the purposes of the wars, a Lancastrian wife, her fortunes bound to that cause. So when the Yorkists triumphed, and her husband fell fighting against them, she found herself not merely widowed but stranded on the defeated side, an enemy of the new regime through a marriage she had not chosen. There is a striking irony in this, given what came after. The Lancastrian widow would marry the Yorkist king and become the very emblem of Yorkist queenship, only to end her life as the architect of a settlement that restored a kind of Lancastrian victory through her own daughter's marriage to Henry Tudor. Elizabeth crossed the deep divide of her age more than once, carried back and forth across it by the marriages that shaped her life, Lancastrian by her first husband, Yorkist by her second, and at the last the maker of the union that joined the two. Few people embodied the whole arc of the wars so completely in their own person, moving from one side to the other, and finally to the reconciliation of both. The 2 sons of that first marriage, Thomas and Richard Grey, are worth following a little way, for their fates illustrate both the rewards and the dangers of their mother's astonishing rise. When Elizabeth became queen, her Grey sons rose with her, transformed from the children of a dead Lancastrian knight into the stepsons of the king, advanced and married and ennobled as befitted their new closeness to the throne. The elder, Thomas, was made a marquess and given a great marriage. The family's fortunes were transfigured by their mother's crown. But the same closeness that raised them also exposed them, as it exposed all the Woodville kin, and the younger son, Richard Grey, would pay for it with his life, executed alongside his uncle, when Richard of Gloucester seized the boy king and struck at the Queen's family. The two boys of the first marriage thus traced in miniature the whole double-edged character of Elizabeth's rise, lifted to greatness by her elevation, and endangered by it in equal measure, one of them rising to a marquisate and the other dying on a scaffold, both fates flowing from the single fact of their mother's improbable crown. To be raised by Elizabeth Woodville's marriage was to be given the world and to be put in mortal danger in the same stroke. Her sons by both her marriages learned this, some of them fatally. The crown that lifted her family so high also painted the targets on their backs, and the wars that had killed her first husband would, in time, kill her sons by both her husbands, sparing none of the men who stood too close to her dangerous greatness. The web of marriages and connections that Elizabeth's elevation created across the English nobility was vast, and it is part of why her rise mattered so much beyond her own person. When a queen advanced her relatives, she did not merely enrich a few individuals, she rewove the connections of the entire aristocracy, marrying her many siblings and children into the foremost houses, and so binding a wide network of families to the crown through ties of blood and marriage. Elizabeth had a good many brothers, sisters, and children to provide for, and provide for them she did, with matches that reached into the highest ranks of the nobility. This had real political consequences, creating a powerful block of families connected to the Queen, which was precisely Edward's intention in encouraging it. But it also bred the deep resentment that we have seen, as the old families found the upstart Woodvilles suddenly woven through the whole fabric of their world, claiming the marriages and the influence they regarded as rightfully their own. The marriages were a source of strength to the crown and of danger to Elizabeth's reputation in equal measure. And in the long run, through the tangle of connections she created, her blood spread widely through the English nobility, so that her descendants and relatives would be found in time throughout the aristocracy and the royal line alike. The country gentlewoman's elevation rippled outward through the whole upper rank of English society, reshaping its connections and seeding it with her blood, in ways that would long outlast the resentment her rise provoked. One detail of these family connections deserves singling out, because it touches the great change of the age so directly. Elizabeth's brother Anthony, the learned and cultivated Earl Rivers who would die on Richard's scaffold, was among the earliest English patrons of the printing press, a man of letters who translated works and supported the new craft that William Caxton was establishing under the family's wing. In him, the Woodvilles touched directly the vast technological and cultural transformation that was beginning to remake the world. While the family was caught up in the bloody dynastic struggles of the dying medieval order, one of its members was helping to nurture the invention that would, more than almost anything, usher in the modern age. There is a poignant symmetry in it. Anthony Woodville stood with one foot in each world, a medieval knight and nobleman who died in the old way, executed without trial in the brutal politics of the wars, and at the same time a Renaissance man of letters who fostered the printed book that would transform learning forever. He embodied, in his single person, the very hinge of the ages that frames his sister's whole story. And his death at Richard's hands was a small tragedy of the transition, a man of the new learning cut down by the old violence, the patron of the printing press destroyed by the dynastic savagery of a passing world. The family that produced the White Queen also produced one of the early champions of the new age, and lost him to the cruelties of the old. The blow landed in February of 1461, at the second battle fought near the town of St. Albans. Sir John Grey rode out for the Lancastrian cause and did not ride home. He was killed in the fighting, leaving Elizabeth a widow in her early 20s with two small boys to raise. Grief was only the first of her troubles. The war that had taken her husband was turning against the side he had died for, and within weeks the Yorkist claimant, a tall and charismatic young man of 19, had swept to victory and been proclaimed King Edward IV. For Elizabeth, this was catastrophe heaped on catastrophe. She was now the widow of a man who had fought against the new regime, which left her and her boys among the defeated in a war of dynasties, their standing insecure and their prospects dim. Worse still, her late husband's mother disputed the inheritance that should have supported Elizabeth's boys, and the lands that were their birthright hung in doubt. A young widow with no husband to protect her, 2 children to provide for, a contested inheritance, and a family marked as enemies of the victorious king. This was the low and frightening place from which Elizabeth Woodville would have to climb. To grasp what that loss meant, you have to understand how a death in battle reached the women who waited at home. There were no lists of the fallen, no official word, no body brought back for burial in any reliable way. A woman learned of her husband's death by rumour and straggler, and the slow filtering back of news from a field she had never seen, often days after the fact, never quite sure until the absence hardened into certainty. And the death of a husband was not merely a private grief, it was an economic and social earthquake. A wife's entire standing flowed through her husband. His rank was her rank, his property the roof over her head, his protection the thing that kept the world's predators at bay. When he died, all of that became suddenly uncertain, dependent on inheritance law, on the goodwill of his family, on the protection of whoever might now take an interest in her. For Elizabeth, the uncertainty was sharpened to a point by the fact that her husband had died fighting for the losing side. The cause he had given his life for was defeated. The new regime had no reason to favour his widow, and the lands that should have passed to her sons were caught up in dispute. She was, at a stroke, a grieving widow, a single mother, and a political liability all at once, with no one obliged to help her, and a great deal stacked against her. Her difficulty throws light on the genuine helplessness of a woman alone in that world, even a woman of birth and spirit. A widow had no natural protector and no independent standing. Her dead husband's family might turn on her. The law moved slowly and favoured the powerful, and a woman could not simply go out and make her own way. Whatever Elizabeth was to recover for her sons, she would have to win by persuasion and by the cultivation of those who held power over her. And so she did what necessity demanded of a woman so cornered. She looked for a powerful friend who could press her case, and she set about getting her petition before the one person whose word could settle everything, the new young king himself. Out of that practical, almost desperate manoeuvre would come the most consequential love match in English history. But it began not in romance, but in necessity. A widowed mother seeking justice for her children from the man who now ruled the land. The legal and economic vulnerability of a widow in that age is hard to overstate, and it explains why Elizabeth's situation after St. Albans was so genuinely perilous. A married woman had no separate legal existence to speak of. Her property and her person were, in law, largely subsumed into her husband's. When the husband died, a widow regained a certain independence, but she also lost her protector and her place in the order of things, and she became peculiarly exposed to predatory relatives who might seize her property, to powerful neighbours who might encroach on her lands, to a legal system that moved slowly and favoured those with influence and money to press their suits. A widow with a contested inheritance and powerful enemies, as Elizabeth was, stood in real danger of being stripped of everything, her children left destitute, with no husband to defend them, and the law an uncertain ally at best. This is the context in which her pursuit of the young king's favour must be understood. It was not the scheming of an ambitious adventuress, but the desperate rational manoeuvring of a woman with her back to the wall, seeking the only protection that might secure her children's future. That the manoeuvre succeeded beyond any imagining ending not in restored lands but in a crown, should not blind us to how it began, as the last resort of a vulnerable widow with very few options and a great deal to lose. Her response to that vulnerability tells us much about the woman she was, for she did not simply accept her reduced state, but set about, with characteristic determination, to do something about it. Faced with a contested inheritance and powerful adversaries, she sought out allies, pressed her case, and manoeuvred to get her petition before the one person who could resolve it in her favour. This was not the conduct of a passive victim resigned to her fate. It was the active, resourceful response of a woman determined to fight for her children's future with whatever weapons her situation allowed. She had few enough of them, no husband, no army, no power of her own, but she had intelligence, determination, and by all accounts a beauty and presence that could open doors. She used what she had, and in using it, she began the long sequence of turns that would carry her to a throne, though no such outcome was in her mind when she started. The same qualities that drove her to fight for her son's inheritance, the refusal to accept defeat, the willingness to seek out the powerful and press her case, the nerve to play a difficult hand for high stakes, would carry her, by stages, far beyond anything she had originally sought. She set out merely to recover her children's lands. She ended by winning a crown, but the journey began in the determined refusal of a vulnerable widow to accept her vulnerability, and that refusal was the seed of everything that followed. There is a story, much loved and much repeated, about how the king and the widow first met, and though we cannot prove a word of it, it is worth setting down for the flavour it carries. The tale holds that Elizabeth waited for Edward beneath an old oak in the forest near Grafton, her two small sons at her side, and that she knelt before him as he rode by to beg for the restoration of their lands. The young king, so the story goes, was struck at once by her beauty, and she was a famous beauty, fair-haired and serene and lovely in a way that turned heads all her life. He desired her and pressed her, and she refused him everything but marriage, holding to her virtue with a composure that only inflamed him further, until at last a sovereign who might have summoned almost any bride in Christendom set his will instead on this Lancastrian widow. How much of that is fact, and how much is the kind of legend that attaches itself to famous lives, no one can say. But something drew Edward to her, with a force strong enough to override every consideration of policy and prudence, and the something was powerful enough to change the course of the realm. Whatever the truth of the first meeting, the courtship that followed unfolded against a backdrop that made it all the more remarkable. This was no peaceful realm in which a king might indulge a romance at leisure. It was a kingdom only recently emerged from civil war, its new dynasty still insecure, its great men watchful and ambitious, its whole order dependent on the young king making the prudent choices that would consolidate his fragile hold. Into this delicate situation, Edward introduced the most imprudent choice imaginable, and Elizabeth, whether by design or by the working of events, found herself the object of a king's serious attention at the worst possible moment for such a thing. The stakes could hardly have been higher, and the danger to her, had it gone wrong, hardly graver. A king's passing fancy could ruin a woman as easily as raise her. To be desired by a king and then discarded was a fate that had destroyed many. Elizabeth navigated this peril with a steadiness that, whatever we make of her motives, commands a certain respect. She neither threw herself away nor played so hard that she drove the king off. She held a course, through waters that had drowned many before her, that led against all probability to a wedding rather than a ruin. The romance of the oak tree may be legend. The skill and nerve with which she handled a king's dangerous desire were real, and they were the first proof of the formidable woman beneath the famous beauty. The famous oak tree under which she is said to have waited still has a kind of afterlife in the legend, and the persistence of the tale tells us something about how Elizabeth's story has always been received. People have wanted it to be a romance. The image of the beautiful widow kneeling in the forest, the smitten young king reigning in his horse, the virtue that held out for a crown. It has the shape of a fairy tale, and it has been told and retold and painted and dramatized precisely because it satisfies that appetite for romance. But the fairy tale framing has done Elizabeth a subtle disservice, for it casts her as the passive object of a king's desire, the lovely prize won by a royal suitor, rather than as the intelligent and determined woman who navigated an extraordinarily dangerous situation to an extraordinary result. The truth, so far as we can reach it, is less a fairy tale than a high-stakes negotiation conducted by a woman with very few cards, played so skillfully that it ended at the altar rather than in the more usual outcome of a king's brief desire. Whether or not there was an oak tree, whether or not she knelt, the essential achievement was hers. She turned a powerful man's passing want into a permanent marriage and a crown. That is not the work of a fairy tale princess. It is the work of a formidable woman, and the romance has tended to hide her formidability behind a veil of charm. The man she had captivated was, in 1464, the most eligible bachelor in Christendom, and worth knowing in his own right. Edward IV was barely past 20, immensely tall for his age at perhaps 6'4", strikingly handsome, athletic, charming, and pleasure-loving, a king who looked and behaved like the hero of a romance. He was also, beneath the easy charm, a formidable soldier and a shrewd judge of men, who had won his crown on the battlefield and meant to keep it. His counsellors, above all his great kingmaker, the Earl of Warwick, were busy arranging a suitable foreign marriage for him, a French or Burgundian princess, who would bring an alliance and a dowry and seal England's place among the powers of Europe. A king's marriage was an instrument of state, far too important to be left to a king's own heart, which makes what Edward did next all the more astonishing and all the more revealing of the reckless, headstrong streak that ran beneath his golden surface. For all his gifts, there was a flaw running through Edward that would shape Elizabeth's fate as surely as his virtues did, and it is worth naming honestly. He was a man who, having won his crown by tremendous effort and courage in his youth, settled in his maturity into ease and self-indulgence. He grew fond of pleasure, of food and wine and women, and let himself run to fat and softness in the long peace of his second reign. More dangerously, he was careless of consequences, careless of the resentments his choices bred, careless of the future he was leaving to a young heir. His secret marriage was the first great act of that carelessness, throwing away a diplomatic asset and humiliating his greatest subject for the sake of his own desire. His failure to settle the succession securely before his sudden death was the last and most catastrophic. Between them ran a whole reign of decisions made for short-term ease or pleasure, their longer costs left for others to pay, and it was Elizabeth and her children who paid the heaviest of those costs in the end. The charming, capable, self-indulgent king gave her a crown and a dozen years of splendour, but his carelessness also helped to set the trap that destroyed her family the moment he was gone, leaving a boy heir and a poisonous tangle of unresolved rivalries for his brother to exploit. The decline of Edward in his later years is a melancholy thing to trace, and it cast a long shadow forward onto Elizabeth and her children. The lean, victorious young warrior who had won his crown at 19 grew, across his years of peace and plenty, into a bloated and self-indulgent man, given over to feasting and drinking and the pleasures of the table and the bed. The discipline that had made him a fine soldier dissolved in the ease of his second reign. He grew fat, grew idle, grew careless of the work of kingship, even as he remained shrewd enough, when he troubled himself to govern well. And this softening had consequences beyond his own person, for a king who indulges himself sets a tone, neglects the hard tasks, and above all fails to prepare for the future. Edward's early death, at not yet 41, was very likely hastened by the excesses of his later years, his constitution worn down by a lifetime of indulgence. And his death, coming too soon and finding the succession unsecured, was the catastrophe from which all of Elizabeth's final ruin flowed. Had he been more temperate, he might have lived longer, seen his son to manhood, and spared his family the disaster that the minority brought. The carelessness that ran through his character to the end, the same carelessness that had married Elizabeth in secret, left her at the last a widow far too soon, with a boy heir and a kingdom full of enemies. Edward's virtues had made her a queen. His flaws helped to destroy her. The children Elizabeth bore to Edward across these years were many, and their varied fates would carry her blood and her story forward into the future in ways worth marking. There were the daughters, the eldest of whom, Elizabeth of York, would become queen and the mother of the Tudor line, while her sisters married into the nobility and carried the blood of York into the great families of England. There were the two sons who became the princes in the Tower, the boys whose vanishing is the central tragedy of the tale. There were younger children, some dying in infancy as so many did in that age of high child mortality, others surviving to play their parts in the years that followed. To bear so many children was itself a kind of achievement and a kind of danger, for each birth carried real risk to the mother, in a time when childbirth killed many women, and Elizabeth came through more than a dozen confinements in an age when that was no small feat of survival. Her fertility was, in the cold terms of dynastic politics, one of her chief contributions, the steady production of heirs that secured the succession and the future of the line. But these were also her children, loved and raised, and several of them lost to the Tower, to infancy, to the dangers of their dangerous world. The royal nursery she filled was both a political asset and a mother's life's work, and the fates of the children who came out of it would shape the history of England for a century and carry Elizabeth's blood down to the present day. The recklessness of what Edward was about to do becomes clearer when you weigh what a royal marriage was supposed to accomplish. A king's hand was the single most valuable diplomatic asset a kingdom possessed. Spent wisely, it bought a foreign alliance, a powerful ally against one's enemies, a princess who arrived with a dowry of money and a web of useful connections stretching across Europe. Kings did not marry for desire, they married for advantage, and the choice of a queen was a decision of state debated by councils and negotiated by ambassadors over months and years. To throw all of that away to spend the priceless asset of a king's marriage on a portionless English widow who brought no alliance, no dowry, and no advantage of any kind, and to do it secretly, without a word to the men whose business it was to advise him, was an act of breathtaking irresponsibility by the standards of medieval kingship. It announced that Edward would follow his own will regardless of counsel, and it threw away an opportunity that could never be recovered, for a king has only one marriage to spend. That Edward did it anyway tells us how powerfully Elizabeth had seized him. It also tells us something about the king himself, that beneath the easy charm lay a streak of willful self-indulgence that would in time cost his family dearly. It is fair to ask what Elizabeth herself wanted in all this, though the records are nearly silent on the question, as they are on so much of her inner life. She may have been in love with the glamorous young king, or she may have been playing, with cool calculation, the most dangerous and ambitious game of her life. The truth is probably that the question is wrongly put, for in that age the two were not opposed. A woman of Elizabeth's intelligence would have understood perfectly what a king's serious attention meant, and what might be won by holding out for marriage rather than yielding to seduction. To refuse to become his mistress and hold out for his wife was the shrewdest possible play, and it is hard to believe so capable a woman did not know it. But calculation and feeling can run together, and she may well have desired the man as much as the crown he wore. What we can say is that she handled the situation with a self-command that argues for a cool head as well as perhaps a warm heart, neither throwing herself at the king nor driving him off, but holding a line that led, against all probability, to a throne. Whether love or ambition guided her, or both at once, she played the most consequential hand of her life with extraordinary nerve, and she won it. The silence of the records on her inner life is, in fact, one of the defining frustrations of telling her story, and it shapes everything we can and cannot say. We know what happened to Elizabeth: the marriages, the coronation, the sanctuaries, the losses, because these were public events that touched the high affairs of the kingdom, and so found their way into the chronicles. But of what she thought and felt, of her own voice and her own view of her extraordinary life, we have almost nothing. No diary survives, no private letters of any intimacy, no record of her speaking in her own person about the things that happened to her. She comes to us entirely from the outside, glimpsed through the accounts of others, most of them men with their own agendas, none of them much interested in her interior world. So the woman herself remains, in a sense, opaque to us, a figure of immense consequence whose inner life is almost wholly lost. We can reconstruct her circumstances in detail and her feelings hardly at all. This is the common fate of medieval women, even queens, and it means that any portrait of Elizabeth must be drawn partly from inference, from what we know of her actions and her circumstances, rather than from any direct testimony of her heart. We see what she did. We can only guess at what it cost her, or what she felt as she did it. The inner Elizabeth died with her, unrecorded, and we are left with the outline of a life whose centre we cannot quite see. What Edward did was marry her in secret. Sometime in the spring of 1464, most likely on the 1st of May, the king slipped away with a tiny handful of witnesses and wed Elizabeth Woodville privately, telling no one, not his council, not his great lords, not the Earl of Warwick, who was at that very moment negotiating a French marriage on his behalf. For months the king kept the secret, continuing to let his ministers pursue the foreign match while he was already a married man, visiting his new wife in secret as opportunity allowed. It was an extraordinary thing for a king to do, and a measure both of how completely Elizabeth had captured him and of how careless Edward could be of consequences when his desires were engaged. A royal marriage made in secret to a commoner widow of a defeated party, with no alliance and no dowry and no consultation, in defiance of every expectation his crown laid upon him. It broke every rule of statecraft at once, and when the truth came out, as it had to, the kingdom reeled. The secrecy itself repays a moment's thought, for it reveals that Edward knew exactly how outrageous his act would seem. A king confident of his choice would have married openly and dared his council to object. Edward married in hiding, kept the truth concealed for months, and let his ministers go on, negotiating a foreign match he had already made impossible, which is the behaviour not of a man making a considered decision, but of one who has done something on impulse and is not yet ready to face the consequences. He must have known the storm that waited. He must have understood that the great lords would be furious, that his diplomacy would be wrecked, that the marriage would be condemned across Europe as a folly. And he did it anyway, and then hid it, postponing the reckoning as long as he could. There is something almost adolescent in the whole episode, the powerful young man, seizing what he wants, and then concealing it from the adults who will disapprove. But Edward was no adolescent. He was a king, and the woman he had secretly married was now the Queen of England, and the concealment could only ever be temporary. Sooner or later the truth would have to be faced, and when it was, the consequences would be exactly as grave as the secrecy implied he feared. There is a question that has always hovered over the secret marriage, and it is worth airing. Whether Elizabeth held out for marriage by design, or whether the king's offer of his hand took even her by surprise. The romantic version has her refusing to be his mistress, and so winning his wife's crown by her virtue, a deliberate and brilliant gamble. A more cynical reading suspects calculation throughout, a clever woman playing a weak king with consummate skill. A gentler one imagines two young people genuinely swept up in a desire strong enough to override all prudence. We will likely never know for certain, and the reality may have held something of all three. What seems clear is that Elizabeth conducted herself, throughout the affair, with a self-possession remarkable in a woman in her vulnerable position, neither yielding cheaply nor overplaying her hand, holding a course that led to the most improbable of outcomes. Whether she planned that outcome from the first, or was as astonished as anyone when the king proposed marriage, she had the wit to seize it when it came, and the nerve to go through with a secret royal wedding that any sensible person would have called madness. The marriage was reckless on Edward's side. On Elizabeth's, it was either the boldest gamble of a brilliant strategist, or the luckiest turn in the life of a woman who knew how to make the most of fortune. Either way, she did not flinch from it, and it made her a queen. The secret could not hold forever, and in the autumn the king was finally forced to confess it, when his council pressed him once more about the French bride and he could no longer evade them. The revelation struck the court like a thunderclap. To marry for love was scandalous enough in a king. To marry a subject of no great rank, but widow of an enemy, was an affront to the whole order of things. But the deepest fury belonged to the Earl of Warwick, and his fury would in time prove deadly. Warwick was the greatest nobleman in England, so powerful and so instrumental in putting Edward on the throne that history remembers him as the kingmaker. He had staked his prestige on securing a French marriage for his king, and Edward's secret wedding made a public fool of him, cutting the ground from beneath his diplomacy and announcing to all of Europe that the king would not be led. The breach between the two men opened that autumn would widen, year by year, into open war, and it would carry Elizabeth and the whole House of York toward the abyss. The position the revelation put Warwick in is worth dwelling on, because it explains the savagery of what followed. The Earl of Warwick was not merely a great nobleman, he was the man who, more than any other, had made Edward king, leading the armies and the diplomacy that put the young Yorkist on the throne, and he regarded himself, with some justice, as the true power behind it. He had been abroad negotiating a French marriage for his king, staking his own prestige and his country's policy on the match, when the news reached him that Edward had been secretly married to an Englishwoman for months. The humiliation was total and public. He had been made to look a fool before the court of France and the whole of Europe, exposed as a man who did not command his own king's confidence, his careful diplomacy revealed as worthless. For a proud man who had grown used to being the maker of kings, it was unendurable, and it planted in him the conviction that if Edward would not be guided, Edward would have to be controlled or replaced, a conviction that would carry Warwick, step by step, into rebellion, into alliance with his old enemies, and at last to his death. The whole bloody final act of the Wars of the Roses can be traced back, in part, to the wound that Elizabeth's marriage dealt to one proud man's pride. It is one of history's intriguing what-ifs to wonder how differently things might have gone had Edward married as his council wished. A French or Burgundian princess would have brought an alliance, a dowry, and the goodwill of the powerful men whose advice he spurned. Warwick would have remained the loyal architect of the regime rather than its deadly enemy. The whole second phase of the Wars of the Roses, the rebellions and the exile and the killing, might never have happened. Elizabeth, in that alternate history, would have lived out her life as a country baron's widow, remarried perhaps to some local gentleman, her name lost to history. The entire subsequent shape of English royalty, the Tudor dynasty, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, would never have come to be, for all of it flowed ultimately from Edward's reckless choice of bride. It is a vertiginous thought how much hung on one young king's infatuation. A more prudent Edward, marrying for policy as kings were supposed to do, would have given England a different and probably more peaceful history, and erased from it the woman we have been following and all who descended from her. That so much should turn on a single imprudent marriage is a reminder of how contingent history is, how the great currents can be diverted by the small accidents of desire and character. Edward followed his heart instead of his counsel, and in doing so he set in motion everything that followed. The wars, the ruin, the Tudor dynasty, the whole future. Elizabeth was the pivot on which it all turned, and she became so by the single fact of having been desired by a king reckless enough to marry her. The breach between Edward and Warwick also illustrates a deeper truth about the kind of kingdom Elizabeth had married into, a kingdom where the crown did not yet truly command, but rather negotiated with the powerful men who held real power in the land. Warwick could rebel against his king and very nearly destroy him because Warwick commanded resources, lands, and armed retainers that rivaled the crown's own. This was the essential weakness of the late medieval monarchy. The king was first among the great lords, but not yet their master, and a sufficiently mighty subject could challenge him on something close to equal terms. The whole tragedy of Elizabeth's life unfolded within this weakness, this perpetual instability in which overmighty nobles made and unmade kings, and the crown sat always at the mercy of the most powerful faction. It is precisely this weakness that the Tudor monarchy her grandson would inherit was built to cure. The lesson of the Wars of the Roses, learned in blood by everyone who lived through them, was that a kingdom could not endure when its great men were stronger than its king, and the new dynasty would spend its energies breaking the power of the nobility and gathering authority into the crown's own hands. Elizabeth lived the disease in its most virulent form. Her descendants would administer the cure. The figure of Warwick himself is worth pausing, because in him the whole problem of the age took human shape. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was the mightiest subject England had seen in generations. So rich in lands, so vast in his network of retainers, so commanding in his influence that he could put kings on thrones and take them off again, which is precisely why history remembers him by the name of Kingmaker. He embodied the overgrown power of the nobility that made the Wars of the Roses possible, and that the wars, in the end, would destroy. A man like Warwick could not exist in a properly ordered kingdom. His very greatness was a standing threat to any king, for a subject who can make a king can unmake him. Edward's elevation of the Woodvilles was, in part, an attempt to build a counterweight to exactly this overmighty power, to surround himself with men who owed everything to him and could balance the independent might of the mighty earls. It did not work. It only enraged Warwick further and helped drive him into rebellion. But the underlying problem Edward was trying to solve was real, and it was the central problem of the age: how a king was to rule when his greatest subjects were nearly as powerful as himself. The Wars of the Roses were, at bottom, the violent working out of that problem, and Warwick was its supreme embodiment. His death at Barnet was, in a sense, the beginning of its solution, the first removal of the kind of overmighty subject that the Tudor monarchy would later make impossible. The fall of Warwick at Barnet marked, in a sense, the end of an era, though no one living through it could have named it so. With the Kingmaker dead, the age of the truly overmighty subject, the magnate who could rival and unmake kings, began its long decline. The wars would continue for years yet, and other great men would play their parts, but never again would a single subject tower over the crown as Warwick had. His death cleared away the most dangerous obstacle to a strong monarchy, and in doing so, it pointed forward, dimly, toward the centralized kingship that the Tudors would eventually establish. There is a thread that runs from Barnet to the Tudor state, from the death of the last mighty kingmaker to the rise of a crown that would tolerate no rivals. Elizabeth lived across the whole of that transition, from the world of Warwick to the world of Henry VII, from the kingdom where a subject could make a king to the kingdom where the king made and unmade subjects at his pleasure. The wars that destroyed her family were also, in the longer view, the violent birth pangs of a new and stronger monarchy, and the death of Warwick was one of its first and most significant moments. She watched the old order of overmighty lords begin to pass, and she lived to see the beginnings of the new order that replaced it, to which her own grandchildren would wield a power no medieval king had ever quite possessed. For the present, though, the king's will was law, and Edward set about making his secret wife a public queen with a splendour that seemed almost calculated to silence the doubters. Elizabeth was crowned in May of 1465, in a ceremony of deliberate magnificence, the full weight of royal ritual brought to bear to transform the country widow into an anointed Queen of England. For Elizabeth herself, the elevation must have been vertiginous beyond imagining. A year or two before, she had been a powerless widow kneeling to beg for her son's inheritance. Now she processed through London in cloth of gold, was anointed with holy oil, and took her place at the summit of the kingdom as its queen. No one of her modest birth had ever risen so high in England. The sheer improbability of it, a gentleman's daughter, a defeated party's widow, lifted to share the throne, was without precedent, and it announced a theme that would run through the rest of her life, that she had climbed higher than her birth had any claim to, and that there would always be those who resented her for it and waited for her to fall. The coronation, when it came, was a spectacle of deliberate extravagance, and its lavishness carried a message. Edward spared no expense in the ceremonies that transformed his secret bride into an anointed queen, and the scale of it was plainly meant to overwhelm the doubts about her birth, to drown the muttering about her unsuitability beneath a flood of gold and ritual and royal grandeur. If the great lords thought the new queen unworthy, the king would answer them not with argument, but with magnificence, surrounding Elizabeth with such a blaze of ceremony that her elevation became simply a fact, accomplished and irreversible. There was a calculated defiance in the very grandeur of it. Edward was not merely crowning a wife, he was daring the kingdom to object, planting his choice so deep in the sacred ritual of monarchy that it could never be pulled out again. An anointed queen was anointed, the holy oil could not be unpoured, the crown not unset. By spending so lavishly on the ceremony, the king made Elizabeth's queenship a thing accomplished beyond recall, and served notice that any who still grumbled about her birth were grumbling now against the settled order of the realm itself. It was a shrewd move as well as an extravagant one, and it worked, after a fashion. No one could undo the coronation, but it could not buy her the thing she most needed, which was acceptance, and beneath the gold the resentment went on smouldering, waiting for its hour. With Elizabeth crowned, her large family rose on her train, and the speed and scale of their advancement bred a resentment that would haunt the Woodvilles for the rest of the reign. Elizabeth came from a large brood of siblings, and the age took it for granted that a queen would lift her relatives. So over the following years the Woodvilles were married into the greatest houses in the land and granted titles and offices, until the old nobility looked up to find the upstart family suddenly threaded through the whole fabric of the court. Elizabeth's sisters were wed to heirs of earldoms and dukedoms. One of her brothers, barely 20, was wedded to an immensely rich old duchess far past 60, a pairing the chroniclers mocked as something close to a transaction. Her father was raised to an earldom and made treasurer of the realm. To Edward, this was sensible policy, a way of building a block of loyal kin to balance the overmighty older lords. But to those older lords, and above all to Warwick, it looked like a swarm of grasping newcomers seizing the rewards and the marriages that should have been theirs, and the bitterness it generated was real and lasting. Much of the dark reputation that clung to Elizabeth in later centuries traces to this, the charge that she was the head of a greedy, grasping clan. The charge was unfair to her, for she was largely doing what any queen of the age was expected to do for her family. But fairness has never had much to do with the reputations of unpopular queens. The unfairness of the reputation that grew up around this is worth naming squarely, because it has distorted Elizabeth's memory for 500 years. The charge against her was that she headed a rapacious, grasping clan who used her marriage to enrich themselves at the expense of their betters, and on the surface the rapid advancement of the Woodvilles lent the charge colour. But step back and the picture changes. Every queen of the age was expected to advance her relatives. It was simply how the system worked, a queen's family naturally rising with her, marriages and offices flowing to her kin as a matter of course. The Woodvilles did nothing that the relatives of other queens had not done. They merely did it from a lower starting point, which made their rise more visible and more resented. And much of the advancement was the king's doing, not Elizabeth's. Edward deliberately built up his wife's family as a counterweight to the overmighty old lords like Warwick, a block of men who owed everything to him and would therefore be loyal. Elizabeth was the occasion of the Woodville rise, but the policy behind it was her husband's. Yet it was she who bore the blame, then and afterward, painted as the scheming head of a greedy faction. It is one of the oldest patterns in the writing of history. When a powerful man's policy causes resentment, it is remarkably often the woman beside him who is made to carry it. It is striking how persistently this kind of charge has been levelled at queens who rose from outside the ranks of royalty, and Elizabeth's case fits a pattern that recurs across the centuries. A woman who comes to a throne by birth, a princess married to a king as part of a grand alliance, is generally spared the accusation of grasping ambition. Her elevation is the natural order of things, requiring no explanation and inviting no suspicion. But the woman who rises from below, who captures a crown she was not born to, attracts a different and harsher judgment. Her very success is held against her. The qualities that achieved it, intelligence, determination, charm, nerve, are recast as cunning, scheming, manipulation, the dangerous arts of an upstart. She is suspected precisely because she succeeded at something she was not supposed to be able to do. Elizabeth was the first Englishwoman of non-royal birth to become Queen of England by marriage, and she paid the price of that distinction in her reputation, becoming the template for the grasping commoner queen that later ages would recognise in others. The judgment says more about the anxieties of a hierarchical age than about the woman herself. What it could not forgive was not anything she did, but what she was, living proof that the barriers of birth could be crossed, that a gentleman's daughter could wear a crown, that the order of rank was not, after all, fixed and eternal. For an age that depended on that order, she was a disturbing figure, and it punished her in the only court available to it, the court of reputation, where it found her guilty of the crime of rising too high. It is worth pausing on how thoroughly her reputation was blackened, and by whom, because it shapes how she has come down to us. The writers who fixed Elizabeth's image for posterity were, for the most part, working under the Tudor dynasty and the Tudors, though they descended from her, had complicated reasons not to burnish her memory too brightly. Beyond that, the chroniclers of her own age and after were men, writing in a tradition that had little sympathy for ambitious women and a ready vocabulary of condemnation for them. A woman who rose as Elizabeth rose, who advanced her family as she did, who schemed as she schemed, fit neatly into an old and unflattering template. the grasping, scheming, overreaching woman whose ambition unsettles the proper order of things. So she was painted cold, calculating, greedy, the head of a rapacious clan, a sower of discord, the standard charges levelled at any woman who exercised power or influence in a world that thought both unbecoming in her sex. It has taken modern historians, looking again with fewer of those assumptions, to recover a fairer picture, a woman who did what her age required of a queen, who showed remarkable resolve in terrible circumstances, and whose chief offence in the eyes of her contemporaries was to have been born too low and risen too high. The cold schema of the old histories is largely a fiction assembled from the prejudices of men who could not forgive a low-born woman for wearing a crown. The modern reappraisal of Elizabeth, which has been gathering force over recent decades, offers a useful corrective to those centuries of distortion, and it is worth knowing how the picture has changed. Historians looking again at the evidence, with fewer of the old assumptions about ambitious women, have found a figure quite different from the cold schema of legend. They have noted that the charges of greed rest largely on her doing what every queen did for her family, that the accusations of pride and coldness come mostly from hostile sources with reasons to malign her, that her conduct in crisis after crisis showed not wickedness but courage, resourcefulness, and a fierce devotion to her children. They have placed her in the context of her age, and found her, on the whole, an admirable rather than a sinister figure, a woman who played a difficult hand with skill and nerve, who endured staggering losses without breaking, and who shaped her nation's future from the depths of her own ruin. This is not to whitewash her. She was a real human being, with the ordinary mixture of motives, capable of calculation and self-interest, like anyone who navigates the corridors of power. But the monstrous Elizabeth of the old tradition, the grasping witch who bewitched a king and headed a rapacious clan, has largely dissolved under fair examination, leaving in her place a more believable and more sympathetic figure, a capable, determined, much-tried woman who deserves to be remembered for her resilience rather than reviled for her ambition. It has taken 500 years to begin to do her justice. The doing of it is still underway. For a few years the storm held off, and Elizabeth lived the life of a queen, bearing the king children and presiding over a court famous across Europe for its luxury and refinement. She gave Edward daughter after daughter in the early years, the eldest another Elizabeth, born in 1466, a child whose own destiny would one day eclipse her mother's. The Queen's days were filled with the ceremony and display that a great medieval court demanded, the feasts and the finery, the patronage of religion and learning, the endless theatre of royalty. She was, by the standards expected of a queen, doing everything right. She was beautiful, she was fertile, she was pious, and she carried herself with a cool dignity that gave her enemies little to seize upon beyond the fact of her birth. But beneath the glittering surface, the quarrel between the king and the kingmaker was deepening toward violence, and Elizabeth, as the symbol and the cause of Warwick's humiliation, sat squarely in the path of the coming storm. The court over which she presided was a world of extraordinary richness and ritual, and worth conjuring for a moment, for it was the setting of her finest years. The court of Edward IV was reckoned among the most splendid in Europe, a place of music and dancing and feasting, of fine clothes and finer manners, of elaborate ceremony governing every hour of the day. There were the great feasts with their endless courses and their displays of sugar sculpture and their entertainments, the hunts and the tournaments, the religious observances that punctuated the calendar, the constant traffic of ambassadors and petitioners and place-seekers. Fashion grew ever more elaborate, the towering headdresses and trailing gowns of the age reaching their most extravagant under Edward's pleasure-loving rule. And at the centre of this glittering world sat Elizabeth, its queen, the still point around which the ceremony revolved, beautiful and dignified and serene. For a woman who had begun as a country widow, to preside over such magnificence must have been intoxicating, and she did it with a grace that even her enemies could not fault. These were the golden years, the long calm between the storms, when the country girl was a queen indeed, reigning over one of the most brilliant courts in Christendom. They did not last, but while they lasted, they were splendid, and she was their crown. Her role as queen, in these years of relative calm, was a particular and demanding one, even if it brought little real power. A medieval queen was not expected to govern. The wielding of authority was the king's business, and a queen who reached for it was viewed with suspicion. Her sphere was different, but not negligible. She was expected to bear children, above all sons, and in this Elizabeth excelled, filling the royal nursery year after year. She was expected to embody the softer, more merciful face of the monarchy, to intercede with the king on behalf of the unfortunate, to be the channel through which mercy and patronage flowed. She was expected to preside over the ceremonial life of the court, to be a figure of splendour and grace, to patronize religion and learning and works of charity. And she was expected to be irreproachable, for any breath of scandal touching a queen threatened the legitimacy of the royal children she bore. Elizabeth filled all of these expectations with evident skill. She was fertile, she was pious, she was dignified. She founded and endowed a college at Cambridge that honours her still, and she gave her enemies almost nothing to seize upon beyond the unalterable fact of her birth. Within the narrow scope a queen was allowed, she performed the role about as well as it could be performed. Among the works of these years, her foundation at Cambridge deserves particular mention, for it is one of the few monuments to her that survives untouched by the controversies of her reign. Elizabeth took under her patronage a struggling college that an earlier queen had begun, refounded and endowed it, and gave it the name it still bears, Queen's College, the apostrophe placed, fittingly to honour the queens who made it. It still stands, still teaches, still remembers her as its patron 5 centuries on. There is something quietly moving in that survival. So much of Elizabeth's life was swept away. Her crown, her marriage's legitimacy, her sons, her wealth, her very reputation, which was blackened for centuries. But the college endures, going about its work of learning. A small, steady flame of her memory kept burning through all the upheavals that consumed the rest. It is a reminder that a life is not only its dramas and disasters, that alongside the great public tragedy of her story ran the ordinary good work of patronage and piety and the founding of useful things. The queen who lost almost everything left behind, among the wreckage, this one enduring and benevolent thing, and it has outlasted all her enemies. Patronage of this kind was one of the genuine avenues of influence open to a medieval queen, and Elizabeth used it with evident care, leaving a mark on the cultural life of her age that the histories of her political troubles tend to obscure. A queen was expected to be a patron of religious houses, of scholars, of artists and craftsmen, of pious and charitable foundations, and through such patronage she could shape, in a quiet and lasting way, the learning and the devotion and the beauty of her time. Elizabeth supported the new craft of printing that was just establishing itself in England. She endowed religious and educational foundations. She was a benefactor of the church, and a patron of learning in the manner expected of a great queen. These were not trivial activities. In an age when the queen's political power was sharply limited, patronage was a real form of influence, a way of leaving an enduring mark on the world through the support of institutions and individuals who would outlast any reign. Much of what Elizabeth built in this way was swept up in the upheavals that followed, but some of it survived, And the survival reminds us that her life was not only the sequence of dramas and disasters that the chroniclers recorded. Alongside the great public tragedy ran a quieter current of constructive work, the patient patronage of good and lasting things, the ordinary benevolent activity of a conscientious queen. It is a side of her too easily forgotten amid the blood and the scheming, and it deserves its place in any fair account of her. Religion ran through every part of her life, as it ran through the life of everyone in her age, and it is worth remembering this, because it is easy for a modern reader to overlook how completely the medieval world was saturated with faith. Elizabeth was a devout woman in an intensely devout age. The rhythm of her days would have been marked by prayer and the observance of the Church's calendar. Her response to crisis would have been shaped by belief in providence, in the will of God working through the turns of fortune. Her foundations and charities were acts of piety as much as of policy, ways of laying up treasure in heaven and securing prayers for her soul. When she fled to sanctuary, she fled into the literal protection of the Church, trusting a holy place to shield her where no earthly power could. When she withdrew at the end of her life to an abbey, she withdrew into the embrace of religion, and very possibly found there a genuine consolation that the world had denied her. We should not read her piety as mere convention, a box ticked by everyone of her station. For a woman who suffered as much loss as Elizabeth did, husbands, father, brother, sons, crown, all torn from her faith, may well have been the one thing that held, the frame that gave her suffering a meaning and her endurance a source. The devout woman who withdrew to Bermondsey at the last was not retreating into nothing. She was retreating, perhaps, into the one refuge that had never failed her. The society she inhabited was, to a degree we can scarcely imagine, ordered by the rhythms and beliefs of the Church, and this too is part of what makes her a figure of the old order rather than the new. The year was structured by the liturgical calendar, its feasts and fasts and holy days. The day was marked by the canonical hours, birth and marriage and death were all framed by the Church's rites. The whole understanding of existence, its origin and meaning and end, came from Christian teaching transmitted by a Church that dominated learning, art, and thought. To be a person in Elizabeth's England was to live inside this all-encompassing framework of faith as naturally as one breathed the air. The great changes that were coming, the reformation that her grandson would unleash, the new learning that would challenge old certainties, the gradual loosening of the Church's grip on every aspect of life, were still in the future, gathering but not yet arrived. Elizabeth lived in the last age of undivided medieval Christendom in England, before the storms of religious revolution broke. Her piety, her trust in providence, her flight to the protection of sanctuary, her final withdrawal to an abbey, all of these belong to that older age of unquestioned faith, an age her own descendants would do so much to transform. She was, in her religion, as in so much else, a woman of the age that was ending, living on the threshold of the age that was about to begin. It broke in 1469. Warwick, no longer able to control the king he had made, turned against him in open rebellion, allying himself with Edward's own treacherous brother George. For a time the rebels held the upper hand, but they captured the king himself and ruled briefly in his name, and in the course of this upheaval, the rebels struck at Elizabeth's family with savage directness. Her father and one of her brothers were seized and executed without trial, their heads struck off on the strength of the Woodville name alone. For Elizabeth, the killing was a wound of the most personal kind, and a brutal lesson in how quickly the heights she had climbed to could turn lethal. The very prominence that had raised her family now marked them for slaughter. The closer the Woodvilles stood to the throne, the better the targets they made. Edward soon wriggled free and was restored, and an uneasy truce was patched up. But the truce could not last, for Warwick had tasted rebellion and found he could not stop. The execution of Elizabeth's father and brother in this upheaval was a calculated blow, and it teaches something hard about the world she lived in. These were not deaths in battle, the ordinary hazard of a fighting age. They were killings of a more deliberate kind, 2 men seized and put to death without trial, on no charge that the law would recognise, simply because they were Woodvilles and the Woodvilles were hated. Warwick struck at Elizabeth's family precisely because their closeness to the throne made them both valuable as targets and vulnerable as victims. To kill the Queen's father and brother was to wound the Queen, to humiliate the King, and to clear away the upstart clan that had displaced the old nobility in the royal favour. It was, in the cold logic of the time, an entirely rational act of political violence. For Elizabeth it was something else, the slaying of her father and 1 brother, men she had loved, cut down for the crime of being related to her. The very elevation that had raised her family so high had also painted targets on their backs, and now the targets had been hit. It was a lesson written in her own family's blood that the heights of royal favour were not a refuge but an exposure, and that the nearer one stood to the crown, the more lethal the position became. These killings also marked a darkening in the character of the wars themselves, a slide toward a savagery that would culminate, years later, in the destruction of Elizabeth's own sons. In the early phase of the conflict, there had been a certain restraint among the great combatants. Defeated lords might be captured, ransomed, pardoned, restored. But as the wars ground on and the betrayals multiplied and the hatreds deepened, that restraint eroded, and the killing grew more deliberate and more total. Men who fell into their enemies' hands were increasingly simply put to death, and the violence reached past the fighting men to their families, their heirs, their kin. The execution of Elizabeth's father and brother without trial was a symptom of this hardening, the wars becoming a matter of extermination rather than mere victory, and the logic, once loosed, ran toward its terrible conclusion. If it was acceptable to kill a defeated enemy's father and brother, it became thinkable, in time, to kill his sons, even his small sons, even princes, even children in a tower. The murder of the princes, whatever hand finally did it, grew out of this long coarsening of the wars, this steady lowering of the threshold of what men would do to one another in the contest for the crown. Elizabeth watched that threshold drop across her lifetime, and she lost first a father and a brother to it, and at the last, in all likelihood, her 2 boys. The wider lesson of these years, for Elizabeth and for everyone who lived through them, was that no height of fortune offered any guarantee of safety, and that the wheel could turn at any moment. This was the great theme of medieval thinking about fortune, the image of the wheel that lifts men up and casts them down, indifferent to their deserving, raising the low and toppling the mighty in its ceaseless turning. Elizabeth's life could have been designed as an illustration of it. She had been lifted from a country manor to a throne, cast down into sanctuary, raised again to splendour, and would be cast down once more into the deepest ruin. The medieval mind found in such reversals not random chance but a moral lesson, a reminder of the vanity of earthly things and the folly of trusting in worldly fortune, which God could overturn in an instant. Elizabeth, a devout woman of her age, would have understood her own life in something like these terms, as a demonstration of fortune's mutability, a warning written in her own experience against placing one's hope in the things of this world. There is a kind of grim consolation in that frame, for it gives suffering a meaning and a place in a larger order. The wheel turns, the mighty fall, only God endures. A woman who had been lifted so high and cast down so low might well have found in this ancient wisdom the only sense to be made of a life so battered by reversal, and the only comfort available to her at the end. The following year the storm broke in earnest, and this time it swept Edward away entirely. Warwick, driven into exile, performed the most astonishing reversal of the whole long war. He made his peace with the Lancastrians he had spent his life fighting, allied himself with the very queen of the deposed Lancastrian king, and returned at the head of an invasion to drive Edward out and restore the old mad King Henry VI to the throne. The Yorkist regime collapsed almost overnight. Edward, caught unprepared, was forced to flee the country, abandoning his kingdom and his pregnant wife to escape by ship with barely the clothes on his back, and Elizabeth, heavily pregnant, and suddenly the wife of a fugitive ex-king with enemies pouring into London, faced the ruin of everything she had gained. She did the only thing she could to save herself and her children. She fled into sanctuary. The reversal Warwick performed that year was so extraordinary that it deserves to be marked, for it shows how completely the wars had unmoored every loyalty. For 10 years the Earl of Warwick had been the chief sword and architect of the House of York, the man who had destroyed the Lancastrians and made Edward king. Now his pride wounded past healing and his power slipping. He did the unthinkable. He crossed to France, made his peace with Margaret of Anjou, the Lancastrian queen who was his oldest and bitterest enemy, the woman whose cause he had spent his life crushing, and agreed to restore to the throne the very Lancastrian king he had helped to depose. To seal the bargain, his own daughter was married to the Lancastrian heir. It was a somersault of allegiance so complete that it beggared belief, the kingmaker turning his coat entirely and making war on the house he had built. And for a time it worked. Edward, caught flat-footed, had no force to meet the invasion, and was driven to flee the country he had ruled for a decade, escaping across the sea with a few followers and the clothes he stood in. The throne that had seemed so secure was empty again, but the old mad king pulled out of the tower and propped back upon it, and Elizabeth, the Yorkist queen, was left behind in a hostile city, heavily pregnant and entirely alone. Loyalty, in these years, had become a currency that bought less and less, and the spectacle of it would have taught Elizabeth a hard and permanent lesson about the world she had married into. Men changed sides as advantage shifted. Brothers betrayed brothers. The king's own brother George turned traitor and joined Warwick's revolt before later turning back again. Oaths sworn on holy relics were broken the moment they grew inconvenient. The great men of the realm calculated their interests afresh with each turn of fortune and attached themselves to whichever cause seemed likeliest to win, then detached themselves again when the wind changed. In such a world, trust was a luxury and a danger, and the survivors were those who trusted carefully, watched everyone, and kept their own counsel. Elizabeth learned this lesson thoroughly, and it shows in the wary, self-contained quality that the records hint at in her. A woman who gave little away, who kept her own secrets, who understood that in the treacherous world of the wars one's safety lay in revealing as little as possible. The openness and warmth that might have flourished in a more settled age were luxuries she could not afford. She lived among people who would betray her the moment it served them, and she conducted herself accordingly, with a guardedness that her enemies read as coldness, but that was, in truth, the simple armour of survival. The treachery of Edward's own brother George, the Duke of Clarence, is the most vivid example of this collapse of loyalty, and it touched Elizabeth's story directly. George was the middle of the 3 York brothers, and across the wars he proved a byword for instability and betrayal, joining Warwick's revolt against his own brother the king, then abandoning Warwick to return to Edward's side when the wind shifted. A man whose allegiance blew about with every change of advantage. His treachery helped drive the rebellions that twice nearly destroyed Edward, and his later intrigues so exhausted the king's patience that Edward at last had his own brother put to death, condemned and executed in the Tower in a famously murky episode. That a king should execute his own brother gives the measure of how poisoned the family had become, how completely the bonds of blood had failed under the strain of ambition and mistrust. For Elizabeth, George was a persistent enemy, one of those who most resented her marriage and her family's rise, and his removal can have brought her little grief. But the spectacle of it brother destroying brother, the royal family consuming its own, was a dark omen of what was to come. If a king could kill his brother, there was little a protector might not do to his nephews. The destruction of the princes a few years later was foreshadowed in the destruction of Clarence, the same lethal logic of a family at war with itself, working its way toward its most terrible expression. Elizabeth watched the House of York devour its own members one by one, and she had reason, had she been able to read the signs, to fear where it would end. Among the stranger protections the medieval church afforded was the right of sanctuary, and it would shelter Elizabeth twice at the worst moments of her life. A person who took refuge in a consecrated place could not lawfully be seized from it. Armed men, however hostile, dared not drag a fugitive out of God's protection without committing a grave sin against the church. So in the autumn of 1470, with her husband fleeing overseas and his enemies flooding into the capital, Elizabeth gathered her young daughters and took refuge in the sanctuary attached to Westminster Abbey. She entered it a hunted woman, the discarded wife of a fallen king, stripped in an instant of everything her marriage had given her, and there, in those cramped and frightened quarters, she gave birth to the child she had been carrying, a son at last, the male heir she and Edward had longed for, born not in a palace hung with cloth of gold, but in the bare refuge of sanctuary, with the family's fortunes at their lowest ebb. They named him Edward, after his absent father. This was the infant later hailed as King Edward V, the child who would disappear inside the Tower of London and become half of its most enduring riddle. All that was still to come. On the day of his birth, he was only a child delivered in concealment, the heir of a family that had just forfeited its crown. The institution itself was a remarkable expression of the medieval church's power and its strange independence from the ordinary workings of the state. In a holy place, the rules of secular power were suspended. The king's writs stopped at the church door, and even the mightiest could not lawfully reach inside to seize a fugitive. It was the church asserting that there was an authority higher than the crown, a protection that came from God, and that no earthly ruler might violate without imperiling his soul. For the weak and the hunted, this created a genuine refuge, one of the very few places in a violent world where the powerful could not simply do as they wished. That such a thing existed at all tells us something important about the age, that for all its brutality, it acknowledged a limit on raw power, a sphere where force must yield to the sacred. The Tudors and their successors would gradually erode and finally abolish the broad right of sanctuary as part of the same centralizing drive that broke the power of the nobility. The new monarchy would not tolerate any refuge from its reach. But in Elizabeth's day the old protection still held, and twice it saved her, the church's ancient shield standing between her and the violence of the men who would have destroyed her. She owed her life, very possibly, to a custom that her own grandchildren's dynasty would do away with. It was a relic of the medieval world that sheltered her across the threshold into the modern one. There is a bleak distinction worth drawing between the two times Elizabeth fled to that refuge, for the second was far darker than the first. When she took sanctuary in 1470, her situation was desperate but not hopeless. Her husband lived. He had escaped to gather allies abroad, and there was every chance, as events proved, that he would return and set things right. She entered the abbey that first time as a woman waiting out a storm, frightened but with reason to hope. The second time, 13 years later, there would be no such hope. Her husband would be dead, with no champion across the sea to come to her rescue, and the man threatening her would not be a foreign-backed rebel but the realm's own protector, wrapping his actions in the forms of law. The first sanctuary was a refuge in a reversible disaster. The second would be a refuge in a final one. But in 1470, she could not know that a worse flight awaited her, and she did what the moment demanded, gathering her daughters and her household and crossing into the abbey's protection to wait, in fear and in faith, for the wheel to turn again. The physical reality of life in sanctuary is worth conjuring too, for it was no comfortable retreat. The sanctuary at Westminster was a cramped huddle of buildings in the abbey precincts, and a queen who fled there with her children, and a reduced household crowded into quarters far meaner than anything she was used to. There was no court, no ceremony, none of the space and splendour of royal life, only confinement, anxiety, and the long wait for news from a world she could no longer move in. She was safe there, in the narrow sense that no one would drag her out by force, but she was also trapped, cut off, powerless, reliant on the kindness of the abbey's monks, and on the goodwill of whoever ruled beyond its gates. To a woman who had reigned as queen, the descent into those cramped rooms must have been a daily humiliation as well as a refuge. And the second time, with her husband dead and her sons in danger, the walls that kept her safe also kept her helpless, able only to wait and grieve and plot while events ran their course beyond her reach. Sanctuary saved her life twice, but it saved it by caging her, and the cage was its own kind of torment for a woman who had known the freedom of a throne. There is a deeper poignancy still in the fact that Elizabeth's 2 flights to sanctuary bracket the whole tragedy of her family, the first and the second marking the descent from her greatest peril to her greatest loss. The first flight in 1470 came at the lowest point of her early married life, and it ended in deliverance. Her husband returned, her enemies fell, and she emerged in triumph with a newborn son in her arms. The second flight, 13 years later, came at the lowest point of her whole existence, and it ended in irrevocable loss. Her sons gone, her cause destroyed, her emergence not a triumph but a slow accommodation with defeat. Between the 2 flights stretched the whole arc of her family's fortunes, the rise to its zenith and the fall to its ruin. The same walls sheltered her both times, but the woman who entered them the second time was not the hopeful young wife of the first. She was a queen who had lost almost everything, taking refuge not in hope of restoration, but in the bare need to survive. The sanctuary at Westminster was, in a sense, the recurring stage of her tragedy, the place she fled to when the world collapsed, and the contrast between her 2 sojourns there measures the full distance of her fall fortune, which had turned so violently against the House of York, now turned again with equal violence in its favour. The spring of 1471 brought his return. Landing in the north with a small force and gathering men as he marched, he met and shattered his enemies in 2 decisive battles within the space of a month. At the first, near Barnet, the great Earl of Warwick himself was killed, the kingmaker cut down in the rout. His long career of making and unmaking kings ended in the mud. At the second, near Tewkesbury, the last Lancastrian heir was destroyed, and within days the deposed Henry VI was dead inside the Tower walls, almost certainly put to death once there was no further use in sparing him. In a few short weeks the entire Lancastrian cause was annihilated, root and branch. Edward returned to London in triumph, and Elizabeth emerged from sanctuary to greet a husband restored, presenting to him for the first time the infant son born in hiding. The wheel had come full circle, and the House of York stood triumphant once more, and this time with its enemies dead. It appeared to stand unshakable. The years that followed were the calm of Elizabeth's life, the long settled stretch when the wars seemed finally over, and the future seemed secure. For more than a decade Edward ruled in peace and growing prosperity, and Elizabeth filled the royal nursery with children, bearing a large brood of sons and daughters, who seemed to guarantee the dynasty's future. The court regained its splendour. The kingdom enjoyed an unaccustomed stability. The new technology of printing arrived in England under Edward's patronage, a quiet sign of the changing age. Elizabeth, secure at last, devoted herself to her family and her religion, and the founding of a Cambridge college that still remembers her as its patron. To all appearances, the storms were behind her, and she could look forward to the ordinary destiny of a successful queen, to see her eldest son grow up and inherit a peaceful kingdom, and pass at last into a dignified old age as the revered mother of a king. The terrible irony, which no one could see coming, was that this very security was about to be ripped apart more brutally than anything that had gone before, and that the agent of the destruction would be a man Elizabeth had every reason to trust. These quiet years are also where we catch the faint signals of the changing age that gives this story its frame, for the world was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to turn. In 1476, a man named William Caxton set up the first printing press in England, under the patronage of Elizabeth's own circle at court, and began to turn out books by a method that would, within a few generations, transform the spread of knowledge and crack open the monopoly of the cloister and the scribe. It was a small thing at the time, a curiosity, a clever new craft, but it was the thin edge of an enormous change, the beginning of the end of the medieval era of manuscript and memory and the dawn of the age of print. Elizabeth lived at the very moment this began, her court among the first to embrace it. She belonged, by birth and upbringing, wholly to the old order, but she lived long enough to see the first stirrings of the new, and her grandchildren would rule a kingdom transformed by forces, like the printed book, that were just beginning to gather in her own lifetime. The calm years of her queenship were not merely a private idyll. They were a hinge moment for England, and she was living through the very beginning of the modern age without knowing that was what it was. It is worth standing back, here at the still centre of her life, to take in the larger movement of the time she was living through, for it was one of the chief turnings of European history. The 1400s were a time of motion in ways that even the sharpest observer of the day could barely perceive. The long medieval order, feudal, hierarchical, looking backward to antiquity and inward to Christendom, was beginning, in 100 scattered ways, to give way. In Italy, the rediscovery of the classical past was kindling the blaze of learning and art that we call the Renaissance. The printing press, newly invented on the continent and arriving in England in Elizabeth's own middle years, was about to multiply books and ideas beyond anything the age of the scribe could imagine. Ships were growing bolder and venturing further, and within a few years of Elizabeth's death, they would cross the Western Ocean and find a whole new world. Gunpowder was changing the nature of war, making the armoured knight and the stone castle slowly obsolete. The very ground of European life was shifting beneath the feet of those who lived on it, and almost none of them knew it. Elizabeth Woodville lived squarely across this profound divide, born into the tail end of the medieval world and dying at the threshold of the modern one. She could not see the turning any more than her contemporaries could, but she lived it, and her life is one of the threads by which we can trace the vast change as it happened. The catastrophe began with a death that no one had prepared for. In April of 1483, King Edward IV, not yet 41 years old and still in apparent vigour, was taken by a sudden illness and died within days. He left as his heir his eldest son with Elizabeth, a boy of 12, now proclaimed King Edward V. A boy king meant a regency, and a regency meant a struggle over who would control the child and rule in his name, and that struggle pitted Elizabeth and her Woodville kin against the dead king's last surviving brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Edward had named Richard as protector of the realm, trusting his brother to safeguard the boy and the kingdom. That trust would prove the most catastrophic miscalculation of his life, for Richard moved with a speed and a ruthlessness that left the Woodvilles reeling. And within weeks the careful security Elizabeth had built across a decade of peace would collapse into the worst disaster of her entire life. The suddenness of Edward's death was the hinge on which everything turned, and its timing could hardly have been worse. He was not an old man. He was in his prime, not yet 41, and though he had grown heavy and self-indulgent in his years of peace, no one expected him to die. There had been no time to prepare for a minority, no careful settlement of who would govern, no binding of the great men to the boy who would inherit. A king who knows he is dying can make arrangements, can secure oaths, can diffuse the rivalries that gather around a child heir. Edward had no such warning. He sickened and was dead within days, leaving a kingdom that had grown used to his strong hand suddenly in the care of a boy of 12. And a boy king was the most dangerous thing in the medieval political world, for he could not rule himself, which meant that others must rule for him, which meant a struggle to be the one who did. The peace Edward had built rested entirely on Edward, and when he was gone it began to come apart within days. The wars that had seemed finished for over a decade were about to resume, and this time they would fall hardest of all on Elizabeth and her children. One can only imagine the speed with which Elizabeth's world inverted in those April days, the dizzying reversal from security to terror. 1 week she was the queen, the wife of a living king, the mother of the heir, her position the most secure it had ever been, her eldest son poised to inherit a peaceful kingdom, and herself to become the honoured mother of a king. The next week her husband was dead. Her son was a vulnerable boy in the hands of an uncertain protector, and the whole structure of her safety had vanished. There was no gradual decline, no warning, no time to prepare or to manoeuvre, only the abrupt fall of the central pillar that had held up her entire world. For a woman who had already endured one such reversal, the loss of her husband and crown in 1470, the speed of this new catastrophe must have carried a horrible familiarity. She knew better than almost anyone how fast the ground could open. She had felt it before, and now she felt it again, worse this time, with no husband to flee abroad and return in triumph, only herself and her children, and the gathering darkness. The suddenness was the cruelty of it. Death gave her no time to secure her son, no time to bind the great men to him, no time to do any of the things that might have saved her family. It simply struck, and the careful security of a decade came apart in days. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the man who would profit from all this, is a figure worth understanding at this turning point, because the whole catastrophe ran through his character. He was Edward's youngest brother, and throughout the reign he had been the loyal one. The brother who, unlike the treacherous George, had stood by the king through every crisis, governed the north ably in his name, and earned a reputation for competence and fidelity. Edward trusted him utterly, which is precisely why he named Richard protector of the realm and guardian of his young son. That trust was the hinge of the disaster. Whether Richard was a long-plotting villain who had always coveted the crown, or a man who genuinely meant to be a faithful protector and was carried into usurpation by ambition and fear once the opportunity opened before him, has been argued for 5 centuries and will never be settled. What is certain is that the loyal brother became, within weeks of Edward's death, the destroyer of Edward's children, that the man trusted to protect the boy king instead took his throne, and that the 2 boys vanished on his watch. For Elizabeth, the bitterest part may have been that the blow came from the quarter Edward had most trusted. The brother who had been the family's loyal servant became the agent of its ruin, and the trust that should have protected her children became the instrument of their destruction. The question of Richard's guilt has divided people for 5 centuries, and it is not ours to settle here, but its bearing on Elizabeth's story is worth making plain, for Elizabeth the question was not academic. Whatever the truth of the prince's fate, it was Richard who had seized her son, Richard who had taken the crown that should have been that son's, Richard who held both boys when they vanished, and Richard who never produced them alive to still the rumours of their deaths. From her vantage, the case scarcely needed proving. The man who had destroyed her family and taken her children into his keeping was the man under whose hand they disappeared. Her own subsequent actions speak to her conviction. She threw in her lot with Henry Tudor, the enemy of Richard, and conspired to put him on the throne, which is not the conduct of a woman who believed her sons might still be alive and in Richard's safe keeping. By aligning herself with the invasion that would destroy Richard, she gave her own verdict on what she believed had become of her boys. We need not share her certainty. The historical question remains genuinely open, but we should register hers. The grieving mother, weighing what she knew of the man and the circumstances, concluded that her sons were dead and that Richard was the cause, and she acted on that conclusion with everything she had left. Her conspiracy against him was, among other things, an act of vengeance for 2 boys she believed he had killed. Richard struck first at the boy king himself. As Elizabeth's son was being escorted toward London for his coronation, Richard intercepted the party, took custody of the young king, and arrested the Woodville relatives who had charge of him, among them Elizabeth's brother and one of her sons from her first marriage, both of whom would later be executed. The news reached Elizabeth in the dead of night, and she understood its meaning at once. The Protector had seized the king and struck at her family. She and her remaining children were now in mortal danger. So she did again what she had done 13 years before. She gathered her children in the darkness and fled into the sanctuary at Westminster, carrying with her the younger of her 2 royal sons and her daughters, abandoning the palace for the cramped refuge of the abbey. This time there would be no triumphant return, no husband landing with an army to set everything right. This time the descent would go all the way to the bottom. The speed of Richard's moves in those first weeks reveals either a long-laid plan or a remarkable instinct for seizing an opening, and historians have argued ever since about which it was. Within days of his brother's death, he had positioned himself to intercept the young king on the road to London. He arrested the boy's Woodville guardians, cutting the new king off from his mother's family at a stroke. He took personal custody of the child, presenting himself as the loyal protector securing his nephew, while in fact securing the most valuable piece on the board. And he did all of this with a smoothness and decision that suggest a man who knew exactly what he wanted and moved without hesitation to get it. Whether Richard set out from the first to take the crown, or whether he merely seized advantage as it appeared and was carried step by step toward usurpation, no one can say for certain, and it is one of the enduring puzzles of his character. What is not in doubt is the effect. In the space of a few days, the careful settlement of the succession was overturned. The young king was in his uncle's hands, the Woodvilles were under arrest or in flight, and Elizabeth, watching from the palace as the news came in, understood that the Protector had become a predator and that her family was the prey. Whatever Richard's deepest intentions, Elizabeth read the danger correctly and at once, and her response shows the hard-won instincts of a woman who had survived disaster before. She did not wait to see how things would unfold, did not trust to the Protector's good faith, did not hope that matters might right themselves. The moment she understood that her son had been seized and her kinsman arrested, she acted on the assumption of the worst, gathering her remaining children in the night and fleeing for the one refuge she knew. It was how a woman behaved once the wars had taught her that hesitation could be fatal and that the powerful did not give second chances. 13 years before, she had fled to the same sanctuary and it had saved her. She reached for the same protection now without delay. There is something both admirable and terribly sad in that practiced swiftness. Admirable because it was the right call made decisively under appalling pressure, and sad because it reveals how thoroughly catastrophe had become familiar to her, how well she had learned the drill of flight and refuge. A woman should not have to know so well how to run. Elizabeth knew it perfectly, because she had been forced to learn it, and the knowledge served her now in the worst crisis of her life. The loss of her brother and her elder son from the first marriage in this crisis compounded her grief and her isolation. Among those Richard arrested and later executed as he seized the boy king were Elizabeth's brother Anthony and her son Richard Grey, men of her own blood, who had been entrusted with the young king's care and protection. These were not strangers, but her closest kin, the natural protectors of her family, struck down precisely because they stood between Richard and his control of the boy. With them gone, Elizabeth was stripped of the very people who might have helped her resist, isolated and surrounded as the protector tightened his grip. Her brother Anthony in particular was a grievous loss, a cultivated, learned man, a patron of the new printing, one of the most admirable figures the Woodville family produced, executed without meaningful trial for the crime of being the Queen's brother and the young king's guardian. The pattern of her earlier losses repeated itself with terrible exactness. Once again, the men of her family were killed for their closeness to her and to the crown, the Woodville name a death sentence in itself. Elizabeth had seen her father and one brother killed in the troubles of 1469. Now another brother and another son were taken from her in the catastrophe of 83. The wars devoured her menfolk one after another, and each killing left her more alone, until at the last she faced the destruction of her family with almost no one of her own blood left to stand beside her. What followed in that sanctuary was a slow torture of pressure and loss. Richard, having secured the elder boy, wanted the younger as well, and he brought every kind of pressure to bear on Elizabeth to surrender him, arguing that the young king needed his brother's company at the coronation, sending a delegation of lords and churchmen to persuade her, making it clear that the abbey's protection might not shield the boy forever. At last Elizabeth gave way and let her younger son go, on solemn assurances of his safety, and watched him cross the threshold of the abbey to be taken to the Tower. Neither boy would ever come back to her. The two boys were lodged in the Tower of London, seen playing in its gardens through that summer, and then seen less and less, until at length they were not seen at all. What became of the princes in the Tower is the most haunting unsolved mystery in English history, and this is not the place to pretend it can be solved. The likeliest hand behind their disappearance has long been thought to be their Uncle Richard's, but the truth has never been established beyond doubt, and honest history must leave the question open. What is certain is the human core of it, that Elizabeth surrendered her youngest son on a promise, and that she lost both her boys into a silence that never lifted. The decision to surrender her younger son is one of the most agonizing moments in Elizabeth's whole story, and it deserves to be understood with sympathy rather than judged with hindsight. From the safety of 5 centuries, it is easy to say she should never have let the boy go, that she should have clung to him, kept him within the abbey's protection, refused every entreaty. But place yourself in her position. She was a woman alone, her husband dead, her elder son already in Richard's hands, herself immured in sanctuary with her daughters, and dependent entirely on the church's fragile shield. The pressure on her was immense, and came clothed in every form of legitimacy. Lords and bishops sent to reason with her, solemn public oaths sworn for the boy's safety, the argument that a king should not be parted from his brother, the unspoken threat that sanctuary itself might not hold forever against a determined protector. She had no army, no champion, no power to resist except refusal, and refusal had its own dangers. She made the choice that seemed least bad in an impossible situation, trusting the oaths because she had little else to trust, releasing her younger boy to join his brother upon sworn assurances of his protection, that the promise was broken, that she never saw either son again, was not a failure of her love or her judgment, but the act of the men who deceived her. She surrendered her child to solemn assurances of his safety. The breaking of those assurances belongs to others. It is worth weighing too, the cruel position the Church itself was placed in. For the pressure to surrender the boy came wrapped in religious authority. It was not brute force that finally prized the child from her. It was persuasion, argument, the moral weight of bishops and lords insisting that a boy could not in conscience be kept from his brother and his king's coronation. That sanctuary was meant for the guilty fleeing justice, and not for an innocent prince. That to keep him was itself a kind of wrong. The very institution that sheltered her was turned into an instrument of the pressure upon her, churchmen arguing that the sanctuary's protection should not extend to a child who had committed no crime and needed none. It was a clever and a merciless line of argument, for it used Elizabeth's own respect for the Church against her, making her resistance seem the obstinacy of a difficult woman rather than the desperate clinging of a mother who sensed the danger. Caught between her instinct, which screamed to keep the boy, and the massed moral authority of the Church and the lords telling her she was wrong to do so, she yielded. We cannot know whether her instinct or their arguments were the wiser. We know only the outcome. But the manner of it, the use of religious and moral pressure to separate a mother from her child, adds a particular bitterness to an already bitter scene. She was not overpowered. She was talked out of her son by men who swore he would be safe, and who were lying or mistaken, and the boy was lost. The fate of the two boys is the wound at the centre of Elizabeth's story, and it is also the most famous unsolved mystery in English history, so a word of honesty about it is owed. We do not know what happened to the princes in the Tower. We do not know exactly when they died, or how, or on whose order, or even though it is the overwhelming likelihood that they died at all, rather than being spirited away. The boys were seen in the Tower through the summer, playing in the grounds, glimpsed at the windows. Then they were seen less. Then they were not seen at all, and they passed out of the records into silence. The most widely held view, then and now, lays their deaths at the door of their Uncle Richard, who had the motive, the means, and the custody of them, and who never produced them alive to quiet the rumours that they were dead. But it has never been proven. Alternative theories have been argued, and honest history must admit that the case is not closed and may never be. What is beyond dispute is the human heart of the matter, and it is this that concerns us. Two boys, the sons of a queen, went into a fortress and did not come out, and their mother never learned with certainty what had become of them. Whatever the precise truth, Elizabeth lived the rest of her life under the shadow of that not knowing, and it is the cruelest of all the cruelties her hard life dealt her. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower has fascinated and tormented every age since, and it is worth understanding why it grips the imagination so. Part of it is the sheer mystery, the unsolved puzzle, that has never yielded a definitive answer, despite 5 centuries of investigation. Part of it is the rank of the victims, 2 royal children, an anointed king's sons vanished without trace or grave. But the deepest part of it is surely the horror at the heart of the thing, that they were children, 2 boys, the elder not yet 13, the younger barely 10, helpless and innocent, swallowed by the machinery of adult ambition. Whatever the precise truth, 2 small boys went into a fortress and were never seen again, and the imagination recoils from it and cannot let it go. For Elizabeth, of course, it was not a fascinating historical puzzle, but the central agony of her life, the loss of her 2 youngest sons into a silence she could never penetrate. We approach the mystery as a riddle to be solved. She lived it as a wound that never healed. It is worth holding both of those truths together, the enduring public fascination and the private maternal anguish, and remembering, when we treat the vanishing of the princes as one of history's great puzzles, that at its centre was a mother who lost her children and never learned how or where they lay, or whether she might have saved them. For Elizabeth specifically, the not knowing must have been a peculiar and lasting torment, worse in its way than a clean grief would have been. When a child dies and is buried, the parent can mourn, can grieve, can slowly come to terms with a loss that is at least definite and complete. Elizabeth was denied even that bleak comfort. Her sons did not die before her eyes or come home to be buried. They simply vanished, and she was left in a permanent limbo of uncertainty, never knowing for sure whether they were dead or alive, where they lay, what had been done to them, whether some hope, however faint, might remain. The pretenders who later arose claiming to be one of the lost princes, the boys supposedly escaped or surviving, must have reopened the wound again and again, stirring a hope that could not be satisfied, and a grief that could not be resolved. To lose a child is terrible. To lose a child into uncertainty, never to know their fate, is a torment of a particular and prolonged kind. Elizabeth bore it to the end of her days. Whatever else those final years at Bermondsey contained, they contained this: a mother who had lost 2 sons and never learned how, living out her days with the question unanswered and unanswerable, the silence where her boys had been, never once broken by any certain word. It is perhaps the cruelest single fact of her cruel life, and it never left her. Meanwhile, Richard had taken the crown for himself. In the space of a few weeks he had the marriage of Edward, and Elizabeth declared invalid, on the convenient grounds of a supposed prior contract, and all their children, including the 2 boys in the Tower, declared illegitimate and barred from the succession. With his nephews set aside as bastards, Richard claimed the throne as the only legitimate heir and was crowned King Richard III. For Elizabeth, the reversal was total and almost beyond bearing. In the span of a few months she had gone from Queen Mother, poised to rule beside her son, to a woman officially stripped of her marriage, her children branded illegitimate, her 2 boys vanished into the Tower, and herself a powerless fugitive, immured in sanctuary with her daughters, at the mercy of the man who had done it all. It was the lowest point of a life that had known many low points, and from inside that sanctuary, grieving and powerless, Elizabeth began to do the one thing still left to her. She began to plot. The legal pretext Richard used to take the throne was a masterpiece of convenient invention, and it struck at Elizabeth in the most intimate way possible. The claim was that Edward, before his secret marriage to Elizabeth, had already been secretly contracted to marry another woman, which, if true, would have made his marriage to Elizabeth invalid and all their children illegitimate. There was no real evidence for it. The supposed prior contract surfaced only when it became useful, advanced by a bishop conveniently, after the principals were dead and beyond contradiction. But it served its purpose. By declaring Edward's marriage void, Richard at one stroke turned Elizabeth from a queen into a discarded mistress, her children from princes and princesses into bastards, and her sons from heirs to the throne into illegitimate nobodies with no claim to anything. It was a cruel and a clever blow, for it attacked not just her position, but the very legitimacy of her marriage and her children's birth, declaring, in effect, that she had never truly been a wife or a queen at all, that the whole edifice of her life had been built on a union that the law now pronounced had never existed, and had cleared Richard's path to the throne by removing every person who stood ahead of him, reducing them all to bastardy with a single convenient claim. There is a further cruelty buried in this device that is easy to overlook, and it cut deeper than mere politics. The marriage Richard's lawyers now pronounced a sham had been the whole meaning of Elizabeth's life. The improbable thing she had risked everything to win, the union that had defined her, raised her, justified her against every sneer about her birth. For 20 years it had been the unanswerable fact at the centre of her existence. Whatever they said about her lowness, she was the king's wife, the anointed queen, and her children were the blood royal. Now that one solid certainty was dissolved with a few words, declared never to have truly existed. It is hard to imagine a more intimate kind of violence than to be told, in middle age, that the central relationship of one's life had never been real, that one's children were base-born, that the whole structure on which one had built one's identity was a legal nullity. Richard struck at her position to gain a throne, but in doing so he reached past the position into the private heart of her life, and unmade there the one thing that had made sense of all her struggle. It was done coldly for advantage, with no thought of the woman it destroyed, which was perhaps the coldest thing about it. The plot Elizabeth set in motion from her sanctuary was the boldest stroke of her life, and it would remake the kingdom. Believing her sons dead, or at least lost beyond recovery, she reached across the deepest divide of the age to make common cause with a woman who should have been her enemy. Margaret Beaufort was the mother of Henry Tudor, in whom the battered Lancastrian cause now placed its final hope, an exile across the sea with the thinnest of claims to the throne. Through trusted intermediaries, the two mothers struck a bargain. Henry Tudor would cross from the continent, defeat Richard in the field, and seize the crown, and in return he would take Elizabeth's eldest daughter to wife, another Elizabeth, joining the House of York to the House of Lancaster in his own marriage, and uniting the two warring lines in their children. It was a design of extraordinary vision, a way to end the wars not by the triumph of one side over the other, but by the marriage of both into something new. And Elizabeth Woodville, the ruined queen in her sanctuary, was one of its chief architects. Her own greatest contribution to history would not be her marriage or her queenship, but this, the alliance that would put her daughter on the throne and found the dynasty that ruled England for the next century. There is a deep irony in this alliance that is worth pausing over, for the two women who made it had every reason to be enemies and none, on the surface, to be friends. Elizabeth Woodville was the Yorkist queen, the widow of the king whose house had spent 30 years destroying the Lancastrians. Margaret Beaufort was the matriarch of what remained of the Lancastrian line, her son the last carrier of that beaten cause. By every logic of the long wars, they belonged on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. And yet, in the wreckage of Richard's usurpation, that they found that their interests had converged with perfect precision. Elizabeth had daughters and a ruined cause, and a hunger for revenge on the man who had destroyed her sons. Margaret had a son with a claim to the throne, and no bride grand enough to anchor it. Each had exactly what the other needed. The marriage of Margaret's son to Elizabeth's daughter would give the Lancastrian claimant the Yorkist legitimacy he lacked, and give the Yorkist queen the restoration and the revenge she craved. It was a cold and brilliant piece of calculation, dressed in the language of reconciliation, and it required both women to set aside the hatreds of a lifetime in service of a shared advantage. That they managed it, that two women on opposite sides of the bloodiest feud in English memory could sit down, through their go-betweens, and carve up the future of the kingdom between them, is one of the quiet marvels of the whole story. The role Elizabeth played in this from inside her sanctuary deserves emphasis, because it is the moment her story turns from suffering to action, and it transforms how we should see her. Up to this point in the tale she has been, for long stretches, the object of events, married, crowned, widowed, hunted, bereaved, acted upon by powerful men. Here, at the lowest point of her life, immured and grieving and stripped of everything, she becomes an agent again, and an agent on the grandest possible scale. From within those cramped abbey quarters, with no army and no wealth and no obvious power, she helped to set in motion the overthrow of a king and the founding of a dynasty. She could not march or fight. What she had was a daughter to offer, a network of loyalties to call upon, and the nerve to gamble everything on a desperate alliance with her family's old enemies. And she played that hand. The woman who had been pushed from pillar to post by the violence of her age reached out from the depths of her ruin and shaped the future of the kingdom. It is the answer to anyone who would see Elizabeth as merely a victim. Victims do not engineer the fall of kings from inside sanctuaries. At the moment when she had lost the most and had the least to work with, she found within herself the resolve to act, and the action remade England. The intermediaries who carried the secret messages between the two scheming mothers deserve a moment's notice, for the conspiracy depended on a fragile thread of trusted go-betweens working in the shadows. A Welsh physician who attended both households is traditionally credited with carrying word between Elizabeth in her sanctuary and Margaret Beaufort in her watched seclusion, that the two women unable to meet or correspond openly, and so relying on a discreet messenger who could pass between them without arousing suspicion. It is a glimpse of how such things were done in that dangerous age, not through grand declarations but through whispered words and trusted servants, a conspiracy advancing by quiet conversations in private rooms, by messages memorized rather than written down, by the patient weaving of an agreement that could cost every party their lives if it were discovered. The stakes could hardly have been higher. To plot against a reigning king was treason punishable by death, and both women were already vulnerable, watched, in Elizabeth's case confined. That they managed, through their go-betweens, to construct so consequential an alliance under such conditions speaks to the determination and the nerve of both. The future of England was decided, in part, in murmured exchanges relayed by a discreet physician between two desperate mothers who could not safely be seen together. It is a long way from the battlefield where the matter would finally be settled, and yet the quiet plotting in those private rooms shaped the outcome as surely as the fighting at Bosworth did. The conspiracy of the two mothers was the hidden engine of the change, and it ran on nothing more than trust, nerve, and the loyalty of a few trusted servants. This is also the place to correct a long injustice in how Elizabeth has been remembered, for the very quality that the conspiracy reveals, her formidable political nerve, was turned against her by the writers who shaped her reputation. To her detractors, a woman who schemed and plotted and engineered the overthrow of kings was unnatural, grasping, dangerous, a meddler in matters beyond her sphere. The same boldness that we might now admire was, in the eyes of her age and for centuries after, precisely her crime. She was a woman who reached for power, and a woman who reached for power was, almost by definition, a wicked woman. So her greatest achievement was recast as her greatest sin, and the resolve that put a dynasty on the throne was remembered as the scheming of a cold and grasping female. The double standard is glaring. Had a man, dispossessed and grieving, conspired from sanctuary to overthrow the usurper who had murdered his children and to place a rightful heir on the throne, he would be remembered as a hero of resourceful loyalty. Because the conspirator was a woman, her resourcefulness was recast as treachery and her resolve as unnatural ambition. It has taken a fairer age to see her plainly, not as a wicked schemer, but as a woman of remarkable courage and ability, who, denied every ordinary avenue of power by her sex, found an extraordinary one, and used it to shape the history of her country from the depths of her own defeat. The design came to fruition on a field in Leicestershire in August of 1485. Crossing from the continent, Henry Tudor came ashore in Wales and drew men to his banner as he pushed inland, until he faced Richard's army at Bosworth. Richard fell in the melee. No English king after him would ever die in combat, as the men around him fell back or turned their coats, and the crown passed to Henry Tudor, proclaimed on the field as King Henry VII. The House of York had fallen at last, but Elizabeth's blood had not fallen with it. True to the bargain struck in the sanctuary, Henry married Elizabeth's daughter early in 1486, and the White Rose of York was joined to the Red Rose of Lancaster in the union that gave the Tudor dynasty its emblem and its claim. Elizabeth Woodville, so lately a powerless fugitive, now found herself the mother of the Queen, and the grandmother of the heir to a new royal house. The wheel had turned once more, and this time it had lifted her family toward a future grander and more lasting than anything the House of York had achieved. The battle that decided it all was a near-run thing, and it is sobering to think how much hung on so uncertain an outcome. Henry Tudor landed with a modest force and a claim most men thought feeble, gambling everything on the hope that England's weariness with Richard would bring support flocking to him as he marched. It was very far from certain that it would. Richard commanded the larger army and held the advantage of the ground. Had the chief lords, whose forces hovered at the edge of the field, thrown their weight behind the king, rather than holding back or turning their coats at the decisive moment, Henry would have been crushed, and the whole design of the two mothers would have died with him in a Leicestershire meadow. But the lords held back, and then turned, and Richard, scorning to run, went down sword in hand amid the press, the final English sovereign ever to perish in open combat. On such accidents the fate of dynasties turned. Had a few wavering nobles chosen differently, there would have been no Tudor dynasty, no Henry VIII, no Elizabeth I, and Elizabeth Woodville would have ended her days as the defeated mother of a failed conspiracy. Instead, the gamble came off, and the woman in the abbey became the grandmother of a royal house. The margin between the two outcomes was a single afternoon's fighting and the choices of a handful of frightened men. The marriage that followed the victory was the true fulfillment of everything Elizabeth had schemed for, and it carried a symbolism that the new regime worked hard to advertise. When Henry Tudor wed Elizabeth's eldest daughter early in the new year, the houses of York and Lancaster were joined in a single marriage bed, and from that union, the Tudors proclaimed, would spring a line in which the long quarrel was healed and the rival roses combined. The Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York were merged in Tudor propaganda and in the actual heraldry of the new dynasty into a single flower, the red and white Tudor rose that still stands as the emblem of that age. It was a brilliant piece of symbolism, and like all good symbolism, it contained a real truth. The marriage genuinely did unite the claims of the warring houses, so that the children of Henry and Elizabeth of York would carry both bloodlines and neither house could feel itself simply defeated. For Elizabeth Woodville, watching from the margins, it was the vindication of her darkest gamble. Her daughter was queen. The dynasty she had conspired to raise was founded. Her blood would sit on the throne of England. The scheme hatched in the despair of sanctuary had come, against all odds, to its triumphant completion. She had lost her sons, but she had won the future for her line. There is a poignancy in Elizabeth's position, even at this moment of triumph, for the dynasty she had helped to raise rose on the foundation of her own deepest loss. Her daughter could become queen, and the houses could be joined, and the wars could be ended, precisely because Elizabeth's sons were gone. Had the princes lived, the elder would have been the rightful king, and there would have been no need for a Tudor marriage to unite the claims. Indeed, no opening for Henry Tudor at all. It was the vanishing of her boys that made her daughter the heir of York, and so made the marriage that founded the Tudor dynasty both possible and necessary. The triumph was built on the tragedy. The crown her daughter wore was, in a terrible sense, purchased with the lives of her sons. One wonders whether Elizabeth felt the weight of that as she watched her daughter become queen, whether the joy of her family's restoration was shadowed by the knowledge that it had been made possible only by the loss of her boys. The records do not say, but it is hard to imagine that so sharp a mind missed the bitter arithmetic of it, that she had won the future for her bloodline at the cost of 2 sons, and that the daughter on the throne stood there because the brothers were in their unmarked grave. It was a victory wrung from the worst of griefs, and the grief was the price of the victory. And yet Elizabeth's own part in that bright new world was strangely small, and the last act of her life is shadowed by a puzzle that historians still argue over. For a brief season she was honoured as the king's mother-in-law, the Dowager Queen restored to her dignity and her lands. But within a year or so of the new reign, she withdrew almost entirely from court and public life, retiring to the Abbey of Bermondsey, across the river from the city, where she would spend her final years in quiet seclusion. Why she retreated is genuinely unclear, and the explanations offered range from the gentle to the sinister. Perhaps she chose it herself, a devout woman of 50 weary of the world's turning, seeking the peace of a religious house after a lifetime of upheaval, a common enough choice for a noble lady of the age. Perhaps her lands and freedom were quietly stripped from her by a wary new king who had no wish for an ambitious dowager near his throne. Perhaps she had become entangled, however lightly, in one of the early plots against Henry, and her withdrawal was the price of it. The records do not let us choose between these with any confidence. What is clear is that the woman who had blazed so brightly across the kingdom for 30 years ended her life in deliberate dimness, withdrawn behind the walls of an abbey. The new king she had helped to make was by temperament exactly the sort of ruler the exhausted kingdom needed, and exactly the sort least likely to leave room for a strong-willed dowager queen at his side. Henry VII was cautious, suspicious, controlling, and relentlessly focused on securing his fragile crown against every possible threat. He had won the throne by conquest and a thin hereditary claim, and he spent his reign watching for danger, building up the power and the wealth of the crown, and crushing the over-mighty nobility whose feuds had torn the kingdom apart. He was, in short, the first of a new breed of monarch, the architect of the centralized Tudor state that would replace the unstable feudal kingdom of Elizabeth's birth, and a man so watchful, so determined to allow no rival centres of power, would have had little use for an independent-minded Queen Dowager with a genius for intrigue and a grievance or two of her own. Whether or not he formally pushed Elizabeth aside, the logic of his rule pointed toward her removal from the scene. The new order she had helped to bring about had no comfortable place in it for a woman like her. She had served her purpose in raising it. Now it had no further need of her, and she withdrew, or was withdrawn, into the quiet of the abbey, while the dynasty she had made got on with the business of ruling without her. The kind of monarchy Henry VII built deserves a closer look, because it is the clearest measure of how the world changed across Elizabeth's lifetime, and because she helped, however unwittingly, to bring it about. The medieval kingdom into which she had been born was, as we have seen, a place where the crown shared real power with the great nobles, where overmighty subjects could challenge kings, where the throne was perpetually vulnerable to the feuds and ambitions of the magnates. Henry VII set himself, with cold determination, to end all that. He broke the power of the mighty lords, curbing their private armies, binding them with financial penalties, gathering authority and wealth steadily into the crown's own hands. He built a more centralized, more bureaucratic, more controlling kind of monarchy, one that commanded where the old kings had negotiated and that brooked no rivals. This was the beginning of the modern English state, the strong centralized monarchy that would reach its height under his son and granddaughter, and it was made possible, in part, by the very wars that had destroyed Elizabeth's world, for the wars had exhausted and thinned the old nobility, killing off the great families and discrediting the chaos of baronial power, and so cleared the ground for the new order. Elizabeth's tragedy and the new monarchy's triumph were two faces of the same historical turning. The bloodshed that consumed her family was the death agony of the medieval kingdom, and out of that death came the modern state. Her grandchildren would rule. She lived the end of one age and helped to birth the next. It is a strange and fitting thing that a woman so battered by the medieval age should have been, through her descendants, one of the makers of the modern one. Elizabeth suffered the worst that the old order could inflict, the dynastic violence, the overmighty lords, the wars that devoured her menfolk, the brutal politics that took her sons. She was, in a sense, a victim of the old kingdom in its most savage form. And yet, through the marriage she schemed, and the bloodline she carried forward, she helped to bring into being the very order that would tame that savagery, the centralized Tudor state that would break the lords and end the dynastic chaos and usher England toward modernity. The woman the old order broke became the grandmother of the new one that replaced it. There is a kind of justice in that, or at least a kind of meaning. The suffering was not the whole of her story. Out of it, by her own nerve and the working of history, came the transformation that ensured no future queen need suffer quite as she had. She paid the price of the dying order and helped to birth the one that succeeded it. Few lives sit so exactly on the turning point of an age, and fewer still contributed so much, out of so much loss, to the turning itself. The medieval world used her cruelly. The modern world, which she helped to make, remembers her as one of its unlikely founders. The mystery of her retreat has invited a good deal of dark speculation, and the darkest version is worth setting out, if only to weigh it honestly. In the spring of 1487, a pretender rose against the new king, a boy put forward by Yorkist diehards as a prince of the old line, the figurehead of a rebellion that ended in battle. And it was at almost exactly this moment that Elizabeth was stripped of her lands and withdrew to Bermondsey. The coincidence has led some to suspect that she had a hand in the plot, or was thought to have, and that her retirement was a punishment or a precaution by a king who could not be sure of her loyalty. It is possible. A woman who had already engineered one dynasty's overthrow from inside a sanctuary might well be suspected of plotting another, and Henry VII was a wary man who took few chances. But the evidence is thin, and there are gentler readings that fit the facts as well. She may simply have chosen retirement, as many great ladies did. Well, as it would kijk neerhad. En nou would let mij uit nog, en dat op sant wikish, some plas were kuns, am botik dis nantlik, en lux din or greiken. Het pakens and spek. The honest position is that we do not know why she withdrew, and the records will not let us choose with confidence between the sinister explanation and the peaceful one. What we can say is that the woman who had lived so publicly chose, or was made, to end her life in shadow. Whatever drove her from court, the broader pattern of her treatment under the new dynasty repays attention, for it reveals something about the precariousness of even the most successful woman's position. Elizabeth had done everything right by the new regime. She had been instrumental in raising it. Her daughter was its queen, her grandson its heir. By any measure of gratitude, she had earned an honoured place and a comfortable old age at the centre of the family she had helped to make. And instead she ended in obscurity, stripped or relinquishing her lands, withdrawn to an abbey, the records all but silent on her last years. The contrast between her services and her reward is jarring, and it points to a hard truth, that a woman's usefulness to the powerful men around her was often temporary, and that once she had served her purpose, she could be set aside with little ceremony. Elizabeth had been useful to Edward as a wife and mother of heirs, useful to the conspiracy as the mother of the bride, useful to the new dynasty as a source of legitimacy. Her usefulness exhausted, she became perhaps merely an inconvenience, a strong-willed dowager with a dangerous past, better tucked away in an abbey than left near a throne. There is a coldness in that, the discarding of a woman who had given so much, and it is of a piece with the whole tenor of her treatment by an age that used women's marriages and bodies and bloodlines for its purposes, and then forgot the women themselves. She had been the instrument of great events. When the events were accomplished, the instrument was set down. Whatever the reason for the withdrawal, the contrast between her final years and the rest of her life is stark enough to give anyone pause. For 3 decades Elizabeth had lived at the very centre of the kingdom's life, its queen, the mother of its heirs, a figure of dazzling visibility, present at every great ceremony, the subject of every court's gossip. And then, quite suddenly, she withdrew into near total obscurity, passing her last 5 years behind the walls of an abbey, across the river, seeing few, doing little, the records almost silent on her existence. There is one recorded event in all those years at Bermondsey, a formal visit from a delegation of French ambassadors, a brief reminder that she had once been a queen whom foreign powers thought worth courting. Otherwise the silence is near total. The woman who had blazed so brightly simply faded, by choice or by compulsion, into a quiet that swallowed the last chapter of her life. Whether she found peace in that quiet, the contemplative calm of a devout woman withdrawing from a world that had used her cruelly, or whether she chafed in it as a kind of exile, we cannot know. The records that followed her so closely through her years of drama lose interest in her once she leaves the stage. She lived her last years in a privacy so complete that history can barely see her, and then, in the first warm days of the summer when she was about 55, she died. It is tempting, and probably right, to find in her withdrawal a kind of completion rather than merely a defeat, a closing of the circle of her life. She had begun in obscurity, a country gentlewoman of no great note, and the long central drama of her existence had been her violent passage through the heights and depths of public life, the crown, the court, the sanctuaries, the conspiracies. To end in obscurity again, withdrawn to the quiet of an abbey, was in a sense to return to where she had started, the great arc of her public life completing itself and subsiding back into privacy. There is a shape to that, a rightness even, whatever the particular circumstances that brought it about. The world had lifted her up and used her hard, and was now done with her, and she slipped back out of its glare into the quiet from which she had come. For a devout woman who had suffered as she had, the peace of the abbey may genuinely have been a refuge and a relief, a place to make her soul ready, and to lay down at last the burdens of a life that had carried more than its share. We need not see her end as purely tragic. It may have held in its quietness a kind of hard-won peace, the rest of a woman who had done and suffered enough and was content at the last to withdraw from the turning wheel and prepare to meet her God. The candle of her public life guttered out, but the woman behind it may have found, in the dimness, something like calm. There is one last glimpse of her in the records that is worth holding on to for the warmth it carries. In the first years of the Tudor reign, her daughter, the Queen, bore a son, Arthur, the longed-for heir in whom the joined dynasties were embodied, and Elizabeth Woodville stood as godmother to the child, grandmother and godmother both, present at the christening of the boy who carried her blood and her enemy's blood reconciled in one small body. It was a quiet grace note near the end of a turbulent life. The old dowager who had lost 2 sons to the Tower and seen her world destroyed and rebuilt, holding her grandson at the font, the living proof that her line would go on. She did not live many years beyond it. In the early summer of 1492, she fell ill at Bermondsey, made a brief and modest will that revealed how little of her former wealth remained to her, and on the 8th of June she died, aged about 55. The godmother role at that christening carries a weight worth unfolding, for it gathers up the whole strange reconciliation that Elizabeth's life had brought about. The child being baptized, Prince Arthur, was the heir to the new dynasty, and in his small body the bloodlines of York and Lancaster, the two houses whose feud had bled England for 3 decades, were joined and laid to rest. Elizabeth Woodville stood as his godmother, a Yorkist queen blessing the Lancastrian Yorkist heir, the grandmother of the reconciliation she had schemed into being. And the boy was named Arthur, deliberately, after the legendary king of British myth, the once and future hero, whose name the new dynasty chose to wrap their heir in the glamour of an ancient and unifying past. It was all of a piece, the joining of the roses, the healing of the wars, the conscious turning of the page from the bloody recent history toward a hoped-for golden age. And there at the font stood Elizabeth, the woman whose own marriage had begun the whole long drama, and whose scheming had ended it, holding the child in whom it was all resolved. She could not have foreseen, of course, that this Arthur would die young and never reign, that the crown would pass instead to his brother, and become the famous reign of Henry VIII. At the christening, he was simply the bright hope of the new age, and she was simply his grandmother and godmother, present at the beginning of a future she had done so much to shape and would not live to see unfold. It is a small scene, easy to pass over, but a great deal is gathered in it. Picture the old woman at the font, for she was old by the reckoning of her age, a survivor of more loss and reversal than almost anyone of her time. She had buried a first husband killed in battle, and a second who was a king. She had seen her father and brother executed, her 2 small sons swallowed by the Tower, her crown taken, and her marriage annulled, and her children bastardized. She had gone twice into sanctuary and twice come out. She had schemed a dynasty into being, and then been quietly set aside by it. And here, near the end of all of it, she held her grandson at his christening, the child in whom the warring bloodlines of York and Lancaster were joined and reconciled, the living proof that her line would carry on into a future she would not see. Whatever bitterness her hard life might have bred in her, this moment at least was sweet, the grandmother and godmother together, the old queen and the new heir. The past and the future met for a moment at a baptismal font. It is the last warm thing the records give us of her, and it is good that they give us this, rather than only the long, sad withdrawal that followed. She had a moment of grace near the end. She had earned it. Her will, made as she lay dying, is one of the most quietly affecting documents of her whole story, and it speaks volumes in a few plain lines. The woman who had once worn cloth of gold and presided over the most luxurious court in Europe drew up a testament that revealed how little of that splendour remained to her. She had next to nothing to leave. She asked to be buried without pomp, beside her husband at Windsor, and apologized in effect for having no rich bequests to make to her children, having nothing of worth to give them. There is a stark dignity in it, this stripping away of everything at the end. The Queen reduced to a dying woman with empty hands, asking only for a quiet grave next to the king she had married in secret so long before. Some have read the modesty of the will as evidence that Henry had indeed stripped her of her wealth, others as the natural state of a woman who had given away or lost most of what she had. Either way, the document is a moving coda to a turbulent life. No bitterness in it, no grand gestures, only a tired woman setting her small affairs in order and asking for a simple burial beside her husband. The widow who had climbed further than any woman of her modest origins had ever been entitled to climb died with next to nothing and asked for little, and was content, it seems. to lie at last beside the man whose reckless love had lifted her so high and cost her so dear. Her funeral was as quiet as her last years. By her own wish, or by the indifference of the court, she was buried at Windsor beside Edward IV with almost none of the pomp that had marked her queenship. A small and modest ceremony for a woman who had once processed through London in cloth of gold. There is a poignancy in that plain ending. The great queen laid to rest with so little ceremony that has struck everyone who has told her story. But it would be a mistake to read her life as a tragedy that simply petered out, for the truest measure of Elizabeth Woodville lies not in her muted death, but in what flowed from her afterward. She had set in motion, from the depths of her sanctuary, the marriage that founded the Tudor age. And through that marriage her blood ran on into the future in a way that the proud lords who had despised her birth could never have imagined. The contrast with her coronation could hardly be sharper, and it is the kind of contrast that makes a whole life suddenly visible. 30 years before, she had been carried into Westminster Abbey in a blaze of ceremony, anointed with holy oil, crowned before the assembled great of the realm, the city roaring outside, every art of monarchy deployed to proclaim her queen. Now she was carried to Windsor in near silence, buried with so little ceremony that one chronicler noted with some disapproval how meanly the obsequies were managed, how few of the great attended, how little was spent. The same woman, the same church burying her as had crowned her, and between the two ceremonies a whole life of dizzying ascent and ruinous fall. There is a temptation to read the plain funeral as the final defeat, the queen brought low at the last, into the ground without honour. But it can be read another way. Perhaps the quiet was what she wanted, a devout woman who had seen through the vanity of earthly splendour, asking for a humble end after a lifetime of spectacle. Perhaps the plainness was a kind of peace. Either way, the contrast between the golden coronation and the silent grave is the whole shape of her life in miniature. The breathtaking rise, the catastrophic fall, and at the last, a quiet that might have been defeat or might have been rest, depending on how one chooses to see it. Her burial place carries its own quiet meaning, for she was laid beside Edward at Windsor, reunited in death with the king whose love had remade her life. Whatever the truth of their marriage across its long and turbulent course, and it had begun in desire and secrecy, and run through 20 years of splendour and storm, they were joined again at the last, the secret bride and the reckless king lying together in the chapel he had built. There is a fittingness in it that transcends the meanness of her funeral. The marriage had been the hinge of her whole existence, the improbable union that lifted her from obscurity to a throne and set in motion everything that followed, for good and ill. It had cost her dearly. The resentment it bred helped destroy her family, and the children of it were torn from her. But it had also been, by every sign we have, a real marriage, a genuine bond between two people, however the politics of it played out. And in death they were not parted. The country gentleman's daughter who had knelt by legend beneath an oak to beg a king for justice, and won instead his heart and his crown, came to rest at last beside that same king, the two of them together under the stone, the long drama of their joined lives finally stilled. Consider what came of her. Her daughter was Queen of England, the mother of the Tudor line. Her grandson became Henry VIII, who would break England from the Church of Rome and remake the religious life of the nation. Her great-granddaughter was the first Elizabeth, the monarch under whom England found its golden age of verse and seafaring and rose to stand among the leading powers of Europe. The blood of the country gentleman's daughter from Grafton, scorned by the nobility as an upstart, flowed through the veins of the monarchs who carried England out of the medieval world and into the modern one. The woman whose marriage had been called a disgrace became the ancestress of the most famous dynasty in English history. There is no neater illustration of how the long currents of history can run through a single improbable life, nor of how thoroughly the snobberies of one age can be overturned by the verdict of the next. It is one of history's quiet ironies that Elizabeth's truest and most lasting power was exercised not in her years as queen, but from the wreckage of her defeat, and not through any office or army, but through her children. As a reigning queen she had held the title and the splendour, but little real power. The authority was her husband, and she filled the constrained and ceremonial role the age allowed a king's wife. It was only after everything had been taken from her, her crown, her husband, her sons, her position, that she exercised the one decisive act of power in her whole life, the conspiracy that put her daughter on the throne. And it is through that daughter, and the children that daughter bore, that Elizabeth's real influence on history flowed. She shaped the future not as a queen on a throne, but as a mother and a grandmother. Through the marriages she made, and the bloodline she carried forward. There is something that rings true to the whole condition of women in her age in this, that the power available to them ran not through the public offices from which they were barred, but through the private channels of marriage and motherhood, and the patient transmission of blood and claim down the generations. Elizabeth mastered those channels supremely, denied every formal avenue of power. She shaped her nation's history through the only avenues open to her, and shaped it more profoundly than most of the men who held the offices she could never touch. There is a savage justice in this that would have astonished the men of her own day. The nobility had despised Elizabeth as a low-born interloper, unfit by birth to share a king's bed, an upstart whose marriage was a stain on the dignity of the crown. They guarded their bloodlines and their precedents jealously, certain of their superiority to the gentleman's daughter from Grafton. And the verdict of the centuries reversed their judgment with crushing completeness. The great houses that had looked down on her largely faltered, married out, or sank into the obscurity of the provinces. Their proud names survive now mostly as footnotes. Hers became the central bloodline of the realm. The very quality they had held against her, the lowness of her birth, was forgotten within a generation or two beneath the magnificence of her descendants, and the upstart queen became the revered ancestress whom later monarchs were proud to claim. It is one of history's favourite tricks, this slow overturning of the snobberies of an age, and rarely has it been played more decisively than in the case of the woman the lords thought beneath them. And so we return to where we began, to the idea of a life lived on the hinge of an age. Elizabeth Woodville was born into the late medieval world, a world of feudal magnates and private armies and dynastic wars settled by the sword, and she suffered that world's full violence, the killing of her husband, her father, her brother, her two small sons, repeated ruin of everything she built. But she lived to see the beginning of its end. The new monarchy of the Tudors that her own scheming helped to raise would tame the great lords, centralise power in the crown, and usher in the more settled, more modern kingdom of the 16th century. The printing press that had arrived in her lifetime would spread learning beyond the cloister. The ships of her final years were already nosing out across the oceans toward worlds the medieval mind had never dreamed of. She stood, without ever knowing it, at the great turning, the last queen of one England, and the grandmother of the first monarchs of another. Her life is the thread that runs across the seam. What gives her story its peculiar poignancy is that she could see none of this, could not know that she stood at a turning, could not guess what her scheming would set in train. She experienced her life not as a grand passage between ages, but as one damned thing after another. A husband killed, a king won, a family murdered, a crown lost and regained and lost again, two sons swallowed by the dark. The meaning we find in her life, the sense of a woman poised on the seam between two worlds, is a meaning visible only from a distance she never had. To herself, she was simply a woman trying to survive, to protect her children, to recover what she had lost in a violent and treacherous time. That is the condition of nearly everyone who lives through a great historical turning. They cannot see the turning, only the daily struggle, and the pattern emerges only later for those who come after and look back. Elizabeth lived blind to her own significance, as we all live blind to ours. The hinge of the age turned, and she turned with it, and never knew that was what she was doing. We give her life its shape. She only lived it. What, in the end, are we to make of her? She was no saint, and the centuries that painted her as a grasping, scheming, cold-hearted upstart did her a real injustice, judging her for ambitions that any queen of her age would have shared and punishing her, above all, for the crime of being born too low to deserve her crown. But neither was she merely a victim, passive before the storms that battered her. She was a survivor of formidable resource and resolve, a woman who climbed from a country manor to a throne, who endured loss upon loss that would have broken most people, who went twice into sanctuary and came out fighting, and who, when she had lost almost everything, found within herself the vision and the nerve to engineer the marriage that remade the kingdom. She lived through one of the most violent and treacherous passages in English history, and she did not merely endure it. She helped to shape what came after. The country girl who rose too high paid a terrible price for her elevation, but she left behind her a dynasty, and a daughter on the throne, and a bloodline that would rule for 100 years, which is to say she won in the end, that game that the proud lords who scorned her had thought to keep her out of. Before we let her go entirely, it is worth holding in the mind the strange completeness of the arc she travelled. She began as a country gentleman's daughter, ordinary in her prospects, married off to a neighbour, destined for an unremarkable life on a Midland estate. She ended as the grandmother of a dynasty, the source of a bloodline that would rule for generations. And between those 2 points she traversed every extreme that fortune could offer: widowhood and queenship, splendour and sanctuary, the summit of power and the pit of ruin, the love of a king and the loss of her children, the making of a crown and the breaking of her heart. Few lives have ever held so much, or swung so violently between such opposite poles. She was lifted higher than her birth allowed, and cast down lower than her dignity deserved, again and again, across more than 50 turbulent years. And through all of it she endured, and at the last she shaped the future even from the depths of her defeat. It is a life that resists easy summary, too full of reversal to be called simply a triumph or simply a tragedy. It was both, intertwined, across an extraordinary span, and it unfolded, from first to last, on the very seam where the medieval world was giving way to the modern one, so that her own dizzying rise and fall became in the end a part of the larger turning of an age. So let the room be quiet now, and let her rest. Think of her not as the cold schemer of the old histories, nor as the helpless sufferer of the romances, but as something more interesting than either, a real woman of intelligence and courage and ambition, who lived a life of dizzying heights and crushing falls across the very seam where one age gave way to the next, and who, through all of it, endured. The candle has burned low, the long wars are over, the roses joined, but the new age coming on, and the country gentleman's daughter from Grafton, who became a queen and the grandmother of queens, has come at last to her rest. If these slow journeys into other ages are something you would like more of, you are welcome to subscribe, and another will be waiting whenever you next have need of it. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.